Hello and welcome to Future Squared. Stephen Hawking once said that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, so let's adapt. My name is Steve Glaveski, and each week I'll bring you conversations with preeminent thought leaders from a variety of fields to help you think in a multidisciplinary way, keep goals in your professional and personal life, and better navigate what is fast becoming a brave, new world. And without further ado,
come with me if you want to live.
My guest today is a second-time guest on Future Squared, Mr. Mick Wall. Mick requested that I interview him for his podcast, Get Your Rocks Off. In fact, he asked me to interview him to cover his life story. Henceforth why this particular episode is quite Joe Rogan-esque and clocks in at over 3.5 hours. Having spent over 4 decades interviewing rock stars and chronicling their amazing stories, we simply couldn't keep this to the usual 1 hour. Our conversation focuses on the early years, taking in Mick's childhood all the way through to Sounds magazine, heavy publicity, and the inception of the world-famous magazine Kerrang. We touch on ghostwriting, his feud with Axl Rose, and revelations about the rock and roll lifestyle. As you might expect, there's plenty of sex, drugs, and rock and roll here, but also some really valuable life lessons. So strap yourself in for my chat with the inimitable Mick Wall. Mick, good to see you.
Nice to see you too, Steve.
Always a pleasure to chat. And, today a little bit different to perhaps what you're normally used to. I mean, you've spent over 4 decades interviewing the who's who in the world of rock and roll. But today we're going to turn the tables. We're going to talk about the Mick Wall story. You know, people know you as perhaps the world's leading rock and metal writer. Everything from Sounds to Kerrang to Classic Rock magazine to your books, writing for Mojo, all sorts of stuff. You've done it all. And I guess a good place to start this might be, why did you choose to become a writer, Mick?
It's a terrible cliche, but it feels more like it chose me. It wasn't that I thought, what shall I do? You know, I just was good at writing at school. And I liked, kids, they draw, like any kid sitting, 5, 6, 7, whatever I was, drawing and all that stuff. But I would also write pretty much the same story every time. Usually a mad scientist brought a dinosaur back to life and the dinosaur destroyed the world. I wrote that story probably 50 times. But it became the only thing I was really good at. And by the time I got to my teenage years, I had an English teacher who he encouraged me. It was more the encouragement. He lavished me with praise. And this was a really serious guy that never, ever lavished anybody in praise. And of course, being a chancer, I kind of played him. I mean, I wrote a story which he loved so much that after that, whenever he would set essays, I would say, "Oh, sir, I feel I could do this better as a poem." And he'd go, "Absolutely, Wall, you do a poem. The rest of you, essays. Wall, you do a poem." And so I'd write about a 10-line poem, take me 5 minutes, and all good.
Done.
And then listening to music, buying albums from about the age of 14, I got into lyrics. I loved lyrics. So I started writing lyrics. I went from doing poems to get out of doing essays at school to actually writing lyrics. And so on and so on. And then by the time I first became a writer for a music magazine, I was 19.
Yeah.
And I left school at 16. I had no university education. My dad couldn't read or write. My mum left school at 14. So it wasn't a book background, and it wasn't go to uni and get a career. It was get out and bring some money in.
Whereabouts did you grow up, Mick?
In London, in West London. My family, all Irish. So I was the first one born in London. So I had an Irish accent until I went to school. And of course, I lost that in 3 seconds flat in the playground because, you know, you don't want to stick out as a kid.
And did being from West London make you a Chelsea fan at all?
Fuck no. I like kid. And I've got 3 younger. I'm the oldest. I've got 3 younger brothers, and the second one down, he actually played for Chelsea,
right?
Until he got injured. No, because my family was Irish, and I first became whatever age you become when you make choices about football teams and things like that. I was 6 or 7. At that time, Best was the biggest football star in Britain.
Yeah,
Georgie Best, the 5th Beatle, and the Beatles, Paul McCartney and John Lennon, and their favourite comedian was Dave Allen, and they had 0 English friends. Football, soccer was actually banned in Ireland at that point still. So everything around me, my culture was Irish. So Georgie Best was, as a boy, was the greatest player in the world. So obviously I supported Manchester United. And the Beatles were my favourite group, not because they were Irish, the 2 main boys, but because I just loved their music. The first record I forced my parents to buy for me was She Loves You, which was, 62, 63? So I was 4 or 5. And I remember that actually was a real kind of future echo thing, because I know I still remember what I loved about She Loves You was, apart from the energy, was it where he loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. And that, yeah, yeah, yeah. People didn't really say yeah outside of America, or maybe in Australia they did, I don't know. But we didn't say yeah. And it was almost like sex. It was almost like it was like an electric charge, and the harmonies and the way it was trebled and echoed. Yeah, 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 and then the song ends with yeah, 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 yeah. It just sounded like the future. So I was really into music.
Well, what music did you grow up on? I mean, I know you mentioned the Beatles, but what did you particularly listen to? And I mean, 5 years old, most people tend to pick up their first record when they're about 12 or 13. It's a bit of a rite of passage from childhood into, say, early adulthood, teenage years. But did you continue buying records or having your parents buy you records as a 5, 6, 7-year-old, or did you come back to it later on?
No, I didn't, because my dad was a musician. He was a traditional, he played traditional Irish music and Scottish music. He had actually left home completely when he was about 14 and gone to Scotland.
Yep.
And lived in Scotland for a long time and travelled around as a musician. He was, for a brief time, he was in a group called Jimmy Shand and his Bandwagon, which was really big in the UK for, a few years. They would release 78 RPM records. But then when he met my mum and they started a family, he became a painter and decorator who also did gigs in the evenings and at weekends.
Yep.
So they always had lots of records, but it was their stuff. I just listened to the radio. I just was a mental radio listener. And then when I was about 13, the first kind of keyboard cassette recorders were available. And I got one of those and I would just tape songs off the radio. But it didn't get serious in that regard till I was about 14. Until then, it was football. So I loved music. I mean, I'd watch Top of the Pops, which everybody did in the UK, and listened to the radio and loved music and really had lots of favourite songs. But when you get to LPs, albums, that moment where you start buying albums with your own pocket money and maybe read music paper,
yeah,
that was 14. And at that point, for me, it was David Bowie, Rod Stewart and the Faces, Elton John, T-Rex, the Stones. You know, I'm sure a lot of people did this over the years. You know, they whatever your entry point. Mine was 1972, but maybe it was 1992 with a Nirvana record, and suddenly you go back and discover the Sex Pistols or Black Sabbath or whatever it might be. You've got a whole history there to check out. And it was the same for me. I went back and started buying Bob Dylan records and Rolling Stones records and Jimi Hendrix.
What was it about rock and roll that enamored you at the time? I mean, you mentioned the yeah, but was it something about perhaps the values you grew up with? I mean, you mentioned no one outside of America said yeah. Britain at the time, I imagine being a young boy in London, perhaps it was a little bit more conservative. I mean, what was it about the rock and roll that really grabbed you at the age of 14 to spend your own pocket money on it?
Excitement, a way out. You know, I mean, my family were
what?
Poverty.
Yeah,
poverty.
So you guys were a working class family.
Oh yeah, but I mean, you know, working class / underworld. You know, underground. I mean, my dad worked for cash, and he worked for himself. So he would be hiring people or firing people, or he'd be hired or fired. And it was all these days what you call the black economy. I mean, I don't think the tax man knew he existed for most of his working life, but it made stuff really hard at home. So we never had a holiday. My dad decided once I got to the age of 10, I was a grown man, so no need for birthday cards or Christmas cards or presents or anything. And then there was a rough patch in my early teens where my parents were so poor that my dad persuaded my mum to go to the Social Security or whatever it was in those days and tell them that he'd left her and to claim benefits. And so it was all kind of, someone knocked on the door. It was, don't answer it, you know. Someone rang the phone. It was like, no, leave that to me. You know, it was all that stuff. So it was shitty. But I went to what's called a grammar school, which was for, in those days when you got to 11, you took all the kids took an exam called an 11 plus. And it was like an intelligence test. And based on that, your senior school, you either high school these days, you went to either a grammar school if you were really upper echelon university material, or you went to what was called a comprehensive if you were, you know, smart kid, maybe vocational. And if you really weren't so smart, or these days you'd say academically inclined, you went to what was called a secondary modern, which was people that would end up working in factories and on building sites. And it was really clearly delineated. And but my parents, A, being Irish, B, being basically illiterate and having no clue what any of this meant, all my friends were getting brand new bicycles if they passed their 11 plus and went to grammar school. And I got fuck all. I remember coming home and saying to my mum, all my friends at school have got letters saying how they did in the 11 plus. Did we get a letter? She went, oh yeah, it's in the drawer somewhere. You know, so I found it and opened it myself. And I was going to like the best boys' grammar school in the area. But I begged my parents to change it because the thought of going to an all-boys school to me was, you know, prison.
Horror.
So I got them to change it to go to the second best grammar school, which was co-ed, which to me made it the first best grammar school, because that was the other thing I was into from a very early age was girls. So it wasn't the connection for me was always about escape. So, you know, like, I mean, by the time punk came along, literally just 4 or 5 years after I bought my first albums, I was 18 when the Sex Pistols released Anarchy in the UK. It wasn't so much the Pistols, but the Clash and all those do-gooder groups, this kind of like, Paul Weller being completely grossed out at the thought of being in a limo, And for me, it was all about being in a fucking limo, diving into a swimming pool, babes everywhere, hookers and blow. I didn't even know what hookers and blow were when I was 14, but that was the dream. Shitloads of money and a lot of angst about being so rich and famous. I mean, the classic rock star Ziggy on the other side of the rainbow. That was the dream for me. And at that time in music, that was our social media. In Britain, we had exactly 3 TV stations. You could have Shit 2, or Shit 3. I mean, we had BBC, but there was you couldn't go, I don't want to watch this politics program. Let's go to 203 and see if there's a movie, or, It was a fucking
that National Lampoon's movie with Chevy Chase, European Vacation, where his son Rusty, they're in the hotel room and, Dad, something's wrong with the TV. There's only 3 channels.
First time I went to America, we're skipping, but I was 22 and I was the UK publicist for Black Sabbath. Mm-hmm. And to New York, they were doing 2 nights at Madison Square Garden. And I checked into the Waldorf Astoria. And I had no idea, I had no idea. This would be a Elizabeth Taylor's stage, or the Queen or something. And I got to my room and I put on the TV. Man, bang, bang, bang. I rang. I was living in a flat with some friends in London. I rang them in London to go, check it out. I'm like, listen, chung, 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 chung. It was like Roger Rabbit, where they go through the tunnel and everything turns into colour and cartoons. And it was like going to Toontown. Different dimension. So for me, it was always about getting the fuck out of Dodge. Yeah. My dad literally picked me up and threw me out when I was 17. Wow. I mean, literally, get the fuck out, open the door, slam the door. Not a penny in my pocket, nowhere to go. And I remember my mum running down the street with her purse and giving me like a £5 note, which... this is 1976, so I don't know what that'd be now, 50 quid. That basically all the money she had. And I slept on floors, I slept on park benches. At 17, I didn't give a fuck, because I kind of felt like, well, I'm on the road now, Hey, of course I'm Bob Dylan when he was first arriving in New York. I'm Bowie before he was famous. I mean, Rod Stewart. Mm-hmm. Every picture tells a story. When Rod Stewart was good, it's hard for people of your generation. It's hard for anybody under the age of 60 to believe that once upon a time Rod Stewart was a fucking genius. Mm. And on his early solo albums was a great songwriter, a great singer. But all his songs are kind of autobiographical. It was all about, before he got famous, dossing around Europe, busking and having adventures. So that's how I felt. I thought, well, I'm having an adventure. And that's all I wanted. I just wanted adventure. And I'd stopped reading. Just on that, I just wanted to touch on that upbringing. So obviously, your dad working for cash, not much money at home, being literally thrown out of the door when you were 17 years old. How did that go on to shape, you and your values and how you approach the world? Because I know by 18, you found yourself living in squalor in a small flat in London, dealing speed to get by and all that sort of stuff. I mean, I'd love to, because, they say that pressure creates diamonds, right? So
how do you think that upbringing, shaped you?
Well, I'm a great believer in nature as much as nurture. But the older I get, the more I realize the nurture side is extremely important. I've got 3 younger brothers, and depending on what all 3 of them did, one of them he talks like that. All right, mate, easy, all right, geezer.
He sounds like Steve Harris.
Yeah, all right, mate. And has never read a book in his life. He's a smart guy. I mean, a fucking smart guy.
Yeah.
But the working world he entered, that's how you talk, right? And then I've got another brother who sounds really middle class, and so on and so on. And depending on who I'm with, like when I used to work with Iron Maiden all the time, me and Steve were very close. And yeah, when I was with Steve, it might be a bit more like that because that's how it is, Fuck off. I'm less of that now as I'm much older, but for most of my life, I morphed into whoever I was with in the room, American, English, whatever. So how did it affect? It made me. It was sink or swim. I am Mr. No Plan B. I am Mr. No Safety Net. So what that means is that no one becomes a well-paid writer or a well-paid anything overnight, but a writer about music. I mean, I think I averaged about 12 quid a week my first year, and it was awful. And so for years, I mean, right up to I think the last actually goes beyond that. So at different points in my career, because I was always trying to stop being a writer. I thought being a music writer was really wangy. I didn't read any music papers by the time I'd been thrown out. It wasn't a small flat, it was a big hippie house. It was an old guest house that all these hippies had taken over. And you had your own room. But I worked on a building site. I did quite a few jobs as a dishwasher. I blagged my way into a few jobs as a chef, which was hilarious.
What was your specialty, Mick?
Burning every fucking thing I tried to cook. That was my specialty. And going out the back, smoking a fag and drinking tea. I mean, there was the best job I ever had as a chef. And this is when I was 25. By the time I was 25, I'd already been around the world. I'd been on telly. I'd been in newspapers and magazines. And but now I'm working as a dishwasher, as the cook at Richmond Ice Rink. And Richmond Ice Rink, because it's mainly kids, and they had an out front desk where you get a sandwich or Coke or whatever. But if you wanted a burger or something like that, they go, "Chef, 2 burgers, please." And I'd be out the back with a book in one hand, fag hanging out, bottle of vodka. I go, "Oh, fucking hell." So I'd have to put the book down, get a burger on, fag. And that was the best job I ever had because it allowed me to get pissed, read books, smoke, and at the end of the night, nick a few steaks up my shirt, So that to me was, I've landed on my feet, But I was also a furniture remover. I was the only white guy on a gang of black guys that were furniture removers that did everything for cash. Again, all the pre-internet and computers, you could do all this stuff. They used to call me Mighty Mouse because I was little, but I was strong. And they were big fuckers, but I didn't want to make it seem like I was the weak link. So I was always getting stuck in. But I've kind of lost the point of this. But in terms of values, sink or swim, do or die. Like in the movies where they go, look, if it's him or me that's going to die, it's going to be him, not me.
Yeah. And so on that, Mick, no plan B, sink or swim, you had all these jobs which nobody really aspires to be a furniture removalist or things of that persuasion, or are burning the burgers out in the back of some ice rink, but it was like 1977 when you responded to an ad to write for Sounds magazine. What can you tell me about that?
It was actually, end of 76 and beginning of 77.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds magazine, which I'd never bought or read, even in the days when I used to buy music papers, because it was kind of the junior music magazine. There was the NME, Melody Maker. They were the two big guys.
Yeah.
And then Sounds, which had launched in early 70s. There's nothing wrong with it. It just wasn't the big major player. And they ran an ad that said writers required, and here was the key point, writers required, no experience necessary. And I literally thought, that's me. No experience. And it so happened that one of the girls that lived in the house, I was 17 when I moved in. They had all been through university and come out the other side. So they were all 23, 24, 25, which to me was fucking ancient at that point, but also a different planet because they'd been through university. Their humor was much more sophisticated. I mean, I've done grammar school, so there was a lot of very middle and upper class people there, and I wasn't completely unfamiliar, but it was a different culture, much more elevated. And one of the women there, so beautiful, oh my God. And I fell in love with her, but she was like 24, you know. But she had a young, she had a younger brother, Pete Makowski. And Pete Makowski was a couple of years older than me, so he would have been 19 or 20. And he'd been writing for Sounds since he was about 15 or 16, something like that. I can't remember his story. I think maybe he might have got a job there working as an office junior. In those days, Steve, you'll find this hard to believe, but when you worked in an office, you had lots of juniors who would do all the shit work because you couldn't just put it in a folder on your computer. You had to stack up a load of paper and give it to someone, and they would take it to the special room and put it in the file. And, you know, there were tea ladies that would come round once in the morning, once in the afternoon with trolleys of tea. Did you want a biscuit? You know, it's a completely fucking different world. So I think he got a job doing some shit job like that and then got into writing. And it was very like Almost Famous. He was like the UK Cameron Crowe, because he would send him off to, you know, he to this day, he's still very good friends with Richie Blackmore, because the first time he met Richie in 74 or something, he'd run backstage like a fan and just gushed over Deep Purple, saying how amazing, Richie, you're my fucking favourite guitarist ever. And he wrote a review which said the same thing. And at that point, people weren't writing reviews like that about Deep Purple or Black Sabbath or Led Zeppelin. And so Pete became that young teenage star. Now, I wasn't aware of any of this. I just knew her name was Yvonne. I just knew him as Yvonne's younger brother. And he seemed cool. He always seemed to have some good records. In those days, you'd carry around LPs. You go to visit your mates, you'd bring some LPs, you know. And I got close to him because he was a lovely guy, but mainly because I wanted to shag his older sister, and I thought this might be a road to it. Turned out it wasn't. But then I was like, what do you do, Pete? So I write for Sounds magazine. And I instantly thought, what a fucking awful job that must be. I mean, you go to a gig and now you got to write about it. I mean, it just makes something like a homework assignment. Like, fuck that, right? But then two things happened, because I was dealing speed and he would come round to buy it from me. And he took me, he said, look, do you want to go and see Thin Lizzy? Because I didn't know. I found out soon after I became a writer, you always get a +1. In those days, you always got a +1, couple of tickets. But you run out of friends that will go with you because you're doing this all the fucking time. They might go to a concert 3 times a year, but you're ringing them every Tuesday, Wednesday going, do you want to go and see so-and-so? Do you want to go and see so-? And they're like, oh, no. You end up going on your own. You end up going on your own to everything. You stop asking people because it's too much of a pain in the arse, or you get to the point where you've attained a certain status, so you know you're going to go backstage at some point, and now you've got the fucking friend hanging. It's just, you end up going on your own. And he said, do you like Thin Lizzy? I love Thin Lizzy. It was the year Boys Are Back in Town being a hit. He said, do you want to come and see him? Fuck yeah. And we went to the show. And, of course, it was one of the greatest shows I'd ever seen, because I would only go and see about 2 shows a year. And then afterwards, we went back, and this was Thin Lizzy in their absolute pomp. Pre-punk, the height of 70s cool. And we got in, they had 4 limos, and we got in one of them with the singer, Phil Lynott, me and Pete. There were 2 page 3 girls. Do you know what a page 3 girl is? I don't know if you have that over there, but okay, no idea. Okay, wow, okay,
some idea.
that great Australian Rupert Murdoch, his paper, The Sun, in the 70s, pioneered what was known as the page 3 girl. So you buy your newspaper, your Sun, and you open it, and here's page 3, and on page 3 would be this stunning-looking bird with enormous tits, topless. Say hi to Janine. You know, she's today's page 3.
This was before the age of PC culture.
Absolutely. In fact, it was considered rather chic. You know, yeah, I have a newspaper with topless women in it. Oh, you don't? Oh, I feel sorry for you, you know. And so he's got a couple of page 3 girls in the limo. George Best is there, and a few other famous people. And then this horrible, horrible looking guy that looked like a fucking rat with hideous spiky orange hair. And at the party, me and Pete are talking to Lynott, and this bloke comes over and he goes, hello, Phil. And Phil goes, all right there, Johnny, fuck off yourself, you know. And he goes, what do you think of the show? And John goes, the show was all right, Phil, but these parties, they're boring. And Phil goes, fuck off, Johnny, go and get yourself a board. Go on, fuck off now. I said to Pete, who was that horrible bloke? And he goes, that's Johnny Rotten. I mean, Johnny Rotten? Who? The fuck? He said, yeah, he's in a group. I said, hang on, his name is Johnny Rotten. And I think literally 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, Anarchy in the UK came out. Fantastic record. And I couldn't believe it was that bloke. So this was my first gig with Pete Makowski as his +1. I'm thinking, I guess it's not a bad job then, you know, although he is going to have to write about it tomorrow. That's going to be a bummer. Yeah. And then he came to see me. He'd been away for a couple of weeks, and he came to see me. Again, this is all leading up to sort of winter of Christmas '76. And I said, where you been? He goes, no, I've been away, you know. I said, all right, where'd you been? He goes, I was in America. I went, America? Wow, holiday? He said, no, I was, do you know Leonard Skinner? I went, duh. He said, no, I went to see, he said, you went to see, I said, so what, you met them? He goes, I was on the road with them for 2 weeks. And then he started telling me about, again, you have to remember, this is no mobile phones. You're in a room, and all that is ever going to happen is in that room. And he talked about being in a high-speed chase with Hell's Angels, guns going off, bars being shot up down in Baton Rouge. And I'm going, fucking hell. And then I'm like, so what were you doing there? And he goes, writing about them for Sounds. And so thick and slow as I am at this point, despite all the speed, I'm going, Thin Lizzy, America. And I said, so did you have to pay to go? And he went, no, you don't pay for anything. You don't pay for anything. I said, and do you get paid? He went, yeah. Cartoon bubbles and stars. And then literally, again, it was a couple of weeks after that this ad came out in Sounds. And I still didn't buy Sounds. I still, you know. And another friend who was older and knew me. He was a mentor. He was a fantastic guy.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the most charismatic artist I ever met. Way more than an Axl or anybody you could care to name. This guy was from the gods. And he said, did you see that ad in Sounds? Number one, I don't buy Sounds. Number two, what the fuck is he doing looking at Sounds? He's from Mount Olympus. He said, yeah, there's an ad. You should have a look. So I went and found it, and it literally no experience necessary. And I went, that's me. And you had to send in this is a long story, so I'll cut it short. You had to send in a test piece. I sent in a test piece written in biro about the David Bowie Low album, which had just come out. And I spent hours and hours to the point where the paper, so many crossings out, and, you know, when you're speeding, you know, the piece of the paper I sent them had holes in, and they must have gone, what the fuck is that? But I got a generic Dear John letter saying, thank you, you're not successful this time, but if you ever think about contributing reviews from your local area, because that was the thing, you could be a useless cunt who can't write a word, but if you lived in some far-off fucking town and Thin Lizzy came to play and you could piece together, their editors would polish it up, and, you know, they just wanted, it had to be anything outside of London. Mm-hmm. Of course, I knew nothing, my local area, so I rang them. I said, I got your letter about so I would like to, I said, okay, where do you live? And I went, London. And you could, now I see them going, you know. They just went, to be polite, they went, okay, we'll do a test piece. So I did another test piece. I reviewed the In Your Mind album by Brian Ferry. Same thing. Sent it in. Nothing. Mm-hmm. So I rang them up and they went, oh yeah, no, that was it. Nothing. So I left it, and 6 months later, I'm drunk, having a few days off from work, and I get back to the house. I'm looking for matches. I'm pulling out in drawers, and I find this letter with reviews in your local area, and because I'm drunk, I rang them and pretended the earlier conversation had never happened. And they went, oh, great, so where do you live? And I went, London. And you could do a test piece. So I wrote about Todd Rundgren's Utopia album, Oops, Wrong Planet. Same deal, sent it in, and nothing. And then I just fucking rang them, got up my courage and rang them and thought, this is me. This is the last call I will ever make about this. And the guy said, yes, pretty good. How about you go and review a band for us? Oh, God. I said, what kind of, music are you into? Like Bowie, Stones, Dylan. And they went, okay, there's a group called The Lurkers, and they're going to be playing the Red Cow pub in Hammersmith on Tuesday night. How about you review that? And inside I'm going, sounds shit. I went, absolutely, sink or swim. And so I went to this fucking awful gig at this shit pub. Funnily enough, the first gig AC/DC ever played in London was at the Red Cow in Hammersmith. And I wrote about this fucking thing, and my girlfriend at the time typed it up. And I sent it in. Nothing. So I ring them up, and the guy goes, yeah, it's very good. It's in the paper this week.
Oh.
What? I run to the fucking shop, and there it is with a picture. And in this very long, boring way, this was how I got my break. Mm-hmm. And from that moment on, every week or two, I'd be sent to some abysmal gig to review a group no one had ever heard of. But I would review it as if it was the Stones at Madison Square Garden, because it was to me, every review I wrote could be my last.
Yeah.
And this was the dawn of punk. So suddenly there's a million punk bands every night. I mean, music is exploding. Music doesn't explode anymore, ever. But back then, it literally was it was like the new internet, you know, it was the punk, you know, you were either connected into that scene or you totally had no idea. And so I connected into it, and but years later, actually, it made me think. When I was the editor of Classic Rock magazine, I remember young writers, might ring them up and say, listen, thinking he's a talented young guy, I'll give him something, you know. And I can remember this happened a lot. I'm going to pick a name out of the blue just because I can't think of anything else. What do you know about Black Star Riders?
Mm-hmm.
Nothing. Well, do you fancy? Well, I don't really know much about it. And I used to immediately think, well, I didn't used to think anything. I just never used to ring them ever again, because to me that guy was fucking useless.
Mm-hmm.
My second ever story in Mojo, they said to me, what do you know about Hawkwind? I went, everything. What do you need? They went, oh, that's amazing, because no one here knows anything about them. I went, leave it to me. And then I went away and researched every fucking thing I could find out about Hawkwind. That is my core value right there. You know, these days we say, don't ask permission. Don't ask permission, just say sorry afterwards or something?
Ask for forgiveness, don't ask for permission.
There you go. I was don't ask for permission.
Mm.
And if you get caught, maybe a bit of forgiveness you beg for, but you know, it was exactly that. And my fortune was that at that time in the world, you could get a shitty job drinking vodka and flipping burgers. You could be the only white guy on a black crew of furniture removers that at the end of the day, they just paid you in cash and smoked a joint. And, you know, that was my fortune. It made life really, really hard. But I hated 90% of the punk gigs I went to because I wasn't sent to the good ones. I was sent to the no-hopers. But very occasionally you'd get a good one. And I would seize on it. And so built it slowly, and did every shit job going because there literally was no alternative. I mean, some of my contemporaries still either live with their parents or have a property that their parents bought for them. Listen, it's jealousy, really. I'm not trying to put them down. I'm jealous that they had that kind of support network.
Yeah. Because
obviously in my field, not the musicians. This is why I get on with musicians, because they're nearly all like me. They come from like the opening line of my Black Sabbath book was the opening line is they were scum and they knew it.
Yeah.
That was me. That's why I related to Sabbath, because none of them. It was fucking make this happen at whatever fucking cost, or just fuck off to the factory. So,
well, that was
my core value.
Double clicking on as well, because you talk about this core value of no plan B, sink or swim, and you know, with Black Sabbath being you know, from Birmingham, it was either, like you said, it was make it in rock and roll or go back to the factories and, you know, like Tony Iommi, and risk having your fingers chopped off and whatever's left of them. But in your case, I mean, it was that persistence. You know, you got rejected several times before you finally found out that your gig review was in the paper, or was in Sounds rather. Now, I guess if you had a plan B or a plan C, if you were one of those contemporaries who had their parents buy them a house, or you had gone off into college and managed to score yourself a comfortable gig somewhere paying you a decent amount of quid, you perhaps wouldn't have tried so hard. You would have taken the first rejection on the chin and just moved on with your life.
Absolutely. And I so really did. There were weeks and months between that initial, have you seen that advert in Sounds, and being published? It was a year. And even then, because I still wasn't very good, I used to have a dictionary by the side of my typewriter. Because I'm young, I thought being a mark of a good writer was to use big words, you know. So I remember I once said the performance was meritorious. And the editor said to me, "Do you write with a dictionary next to you?" No. Who would do that? He goes, "Well, where do you get meritorious from?" I had no idea. He said, "It just means noteworthy, praiseworthy." I went, "Oh, yeah." He said, "Well, just say noteworthy. This is sounds. It's not, fucking Greek philosophy."
Yeah.
I was like, "Oh, absolutely." And walked away thinking, what a cunt. I do my best. And but values, I struggle with that because my value was always the end justified the means.
Mm-hmm.
And I totally don't believe that. But that was the rule I had to live by. And even at this stage of my career, when it comes to money, I need therapy because it becomes not even tribal, primitive. In my head, if someone fucks me up over money, I can't get past it. I will leap out of the bushes with a knife, and people will be going, "But Mick, it's only 500. Only 500. I mean, I don't jump out the bushes, but in my mind, that person is on the shit list forever.
Yeah.
And that is so stupid. That's self-harming. That's damaging. There's no upside to that. All I can say is that my way of trying to make that better is through my children. I have 3 children.
Mm-hmm. How old are your children?
My oldest daughter is 20. Mm-hmm. She's just begun her 2nd year English and creative writing degree course at university.
Next generation.
My ardent wish is that she can write my books for me and I can just sit there and collect the money. My next daughter down, she goes to a performing arts college. She's 17 and she's really, really good. And my boy, who is nearly 15, he's just started his GCSE course and he might be the smartest of the 3. But I decided long before they were born, long before I was even married to my wife, that when I had children, they would all fucking go to university. And I wasn't going to listen to any of this bullshit about, but some people, they're just not suited to university. I said, and I've fucking met millions of them and they've all got degrees and great jobs and they're all fucking idiots, but they still went to university and they now work in publishing or television. I know they're twats, but they're well-paid, comfortable twats and not going to be smoking a fag over the chip fryer at Richmond Ice Rink. Or in my case, I've tried to walk away from music writing so many times. I mean, the most recent time was in the mid-90s. And what did I end up doing? I ended up doing terrible jobs that didn't pay well. And eventually went back to writing because I needed the money. And then finally, I was about 40. I think I was 40 before I reconciled to maybe I'll just be a writer. And at that point, once I just chilled the fuck out, things started happening much better for me. It's still really hard. I literally got an email this morning. I'm doing this because of a computer over here, confirming some money I've got coming in. And I was saying to my wife, Linda, that's Christmas. We're going to be okay till Christmas. And then in January, we'll worry about that. By the time we get there, hopefully I've done more things and have some money coming in January. I live in a perpetual state of hunter-gathering.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Cool. I mean, just to unpack that a little bit, I mean, given that you've spent, 43 years writing, whether it was books,
published
published
longer
writing.
than that writing.
Well, longer than actually writing, yeah, of course. but to still have that sort of, whether it's anxiety or a form of self-doubt as to whether or not this is what you should be doing after all this time, after all the success that you've had on paper. It's just interesting because I think it's something that so many people perhaps listening can relate based on whatever they're doing with their lives. There's always that question, should I be doing something else? Is there something more? And sometimes success can kind of quell that anxiety, but in your case, like you've obviously still got some of these question marks even now at the age of, what are you, 60, 62 now?
62.
Yeah, it's just an interesting...
I mean, I know I don't look a day over 39.
21. I was going to say 21. The only thing that's missing is the hair that you had when you were 21, and there's the old mullet that I saw when you were interviewing Alice Cooper in something like 86.
Yeah, but go back to 76 and you'd see, this like hair like this. I'll be going, yeah, man, yeah, Steve, yeah, that's cool, yeah.
All right. So while you were at Sounds, Mick, I mean, you were, like you said, covering punk bands, most of which you had no interest for, you didn't really care for. You covered new wave, rockabilly, all that sort of stuff. You were at Sounds for a couple of years, but then an opportunity came up to go and join a PR firm by the name of Heavy Publicity, which almost sounds like
Heavy Publicity
publicity firm. So what can you tell me about that? I mean, why did you leave the world of writing to pursue PR? Was it because it was just another way to make quid and be in the business of rock and roll?
Totally. That was it. Plus I felt I'd be good at it. But in the summer of 78, I've been a published writer for Sounds for about 10 months. My mum and dad had let me go back, but they'd given my bedroom away to my youngest brother. So I had to sleep in the same bedroom as two other brothers, but in like a camp bed. So it was, this is temporary, And I got a job paying £40 a week cash, working at an independent label called Step Forward Records, which was owned by Miles Copeland, who we now know as the manager of the Police. He was the manager of the Police then too, except they were the uncoolest old man punk band in London. Everybody thought they were a complete rubbish joke, which they kind of were. But he hooked up with Mark Perry. Mark P was the guy that brought us Sniffing Glue, the world's first kind of, not the world's first, but in terms of punk, the first punk fanzine. And so it was Step Forward Records, Illegal Records, Deptford Fun City Records. It was four people in a room, and I was one of them. The famous groups were the Police would become famous after I got sacked, but the Police, Chelsea, Alternative TV, The Fall, Clock DVA, Squeeze, and a million other groups that you've never heard of and I can't remember. We had some reggae artists, and it was really horrible because the guy that ran the Publicity was a really fucked up guy. I don't really want to get into it, but he made my life miserable. So I used to spend most of my time, because everything was in the one building off Portobello Road, and downstairs was where they did distribution. They would literally get the records, put them in boxes and send them to the shops. And down there was the reggae guys, and they were always smoking these enormous jumbo-sized joints. So I used to, all right, guys, just coming to say hi. 2 hours later, they'll be yelling and says, Mick, where are you? So I hated that job, and eventually they sacked me. But just before they sacked me, I was still writing reviews for Sounds occasionally. But this was my job, and much as I hated it, it paid £40 cash every week, and I was at gigs every night. And instead of being a lowly stringer for Sounds magazine, I was Mick from Step Forward. It conferred it was a step up.
Yeah, bit of status.
Even though I was really miserable. And so I moved out my mum and dad's and took a room in a flat. And I think literally 2 weeks after that, they sacked me. And I'm in a flat and I've been sacked. So what am I going to do? And so I got out my little contacts book, which really was a book in those days. And I began at A and worked my way through, just rang every person I knew in the business, which wasn't that many, and just said, look, if there's anything you need doing, you want a press release writing or someone to come in and answer the phones, whatever. And virtually the first person I rang was one of the partners at Heavy Publicity. And she said, actually, one of our guys is about to take a leave of absence for 12 weeks. He takes care of regional press, which is big artist comes in, the partners would sort out interviews in the NME and Daily Mirror or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. The regional guy would sort out your interviews with the Manchester Evening News, the Glasgow Herald, the dumb fuck middle of nowhere weekly. And so that was what he did. And they said, if you want to come in and do that for 12 weeks, we'll pay you £50 a week. So again, did I know what I was doing? No. What I heard was, we'll pay you £50 a week. I had to get 2 trains to get there, a bus, and back again. It was a fucking schlep, but I loved it. I fucking loved it. They did the PR for Dire Straits, just as they were having their first hit with Sultans of Swing. Mm-hmm. Black Sabbath, who had just fired Ozzy, so that could look dodgy. They did Journey, REO Speedwagon, Styx. They did the Tubes, the Damned, Hawkwind, loads of other ones that were small. And my first day in the office, I'd been in this really grungy punk Step Forward Records, everybody with, even me, with like spiked black hair, pale, and now I'm in this place where everybody's tan and long hair and wearing their Journey T-shirts and their fucking gold lame tour jackets. But it's really a lot of money. It's money. It's a cool office. And I sit opposite this beautiful blonde woman who is like the secretary, PA, whatever she is. And the partners are over there and they're really sophisticated. And literally my first morning, I am talking to the I don't know what your people's geography of the UK is, but when I say Rochdale, I mean somewhere up north, which in the UK means somewhere, you don't want to be. A minor fuck all paper, but I'm getting on great with them. And as I'm doing this, the woman partner, who shall remain nameless, came over and put a mirror. This is like 10:30 in the morning. Put a mirror on the desk in front of me with a couple of huge fat white lines, and she'd emptied out I haven't got one. Have I got one? Emptied out like an old-fashioned biro. She'd taken the ink thing out, so just and shoved it up my nose. And I just, like a pro, yeah, just a second, Mike. Yeah, but no, they're a really great band, and I'll send you the LP, And I remember she later told me she was that's when she knew I would be great, because I was so cool. I just did it, got back to work. And that to them was a mark of class. That to them was equivalent to going, you see, I got a first-class degree in wankonomics, so I'm wonderful. That to them was like, he's the real deal. Now, I didn't even know what that powder was. I was praying it wasn't speed, because by the end of my tenure as a speed dealer, I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't. To this, I just couldn't. It really fucked me up. There was no buzz, no joy. Mm-hmm. It was like taking a pill of ultimate depression and paranoia. It just would fuck me up. Mm-hmm. But I did it, man, because a bit of my do or die brain knew if the chick was going to do this, and I go, oh, not for me, thank you. That closed a fucking door somewhere. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't about the powder. It didn't matter if it made me feel good or not. I just understood this was an olive branch. This was a test. This was So I did it. Now, it turned out it wasn't speed, it was cocaine. I'd only ever done cocaine once before, and it was in the company of this same woman, which is a great story, which I'll tell you in a minute. And I wasn't, cocaine, I mean, it really didn't do much for me. A lot of people used to say this. I don't know about now because we live in the age of super drugs, but cocaine would give you a buzz for 15 minutes, and then you'd need another one, and then another one, and now you're all gacked out and fucked.
Yeah.
But in those days, heavy publicity, because it was the glam PR. We did the Damned, but that's because they were one of the punk originals. We did Blondie for 5 minutes. We did a few like that. But we did the superstar rock bands. And literally their USP, as we'd call it now, was, oh, hi, Steve. You're coming in to interview, who did I say we did? You're coming in to interview Mark Knopfler. Mm-hmm. Cool, man. Turn up at 11, 2, whatever it is. You turn up. We'll go, Steve, baby. Shh. There you go. And if you had any sense, you'd take it. And in those days, people did. I mean, cocaine in 1979 was like saying champagne. Would you like some vintage caviar? What are you going to do? Oh, no, I'll have a bacon sandwich. No, it's all part of the trip, And, and that's when I really understood. It wasn't about, is this guy a good guy? Does he like the album? Is it going to be a good... It was no. Whatever band we do, they're going to write and say they're amazing because they just like being here. And it was true. So we would have journalists, the most famous music journalists in the UK ever, would come by every week. We would load them up with LPs that we knew they were just going to go and sell and buy drugs with. But we'd have the glamorous blonde assistant racking out the lines, bottles of brandy, champagne. That was all of it. And we'd never get rid of them. We had one guy stayed for 3 days. It's true. And then a really funny one was a guy called Malcolm Doane, who these days is a very famous metal writer. And in 1979, he got his break with a little magazine called Record Mirror, which was a pop magazine. It did not do rock. But suddenly, the editor told us he had this new guy who was going to write about rock. And he would come to our office and interview Hawkwind. We couldn't believe our fucking luck. Hawkwind in Record Mirror. It was like, okay. So this little guy turns up. He's the editor of the Jewish Chronicle or something like that. He's got a YAML car. He's really hyper. Hi, I'm Malcolm. And we were like, man, come in. Yeah. He's like, oh, no, I don't. And we went, oh, okay. Joint? Oh, no, not for me. Okay. Brandy? No. And now we've never encountered this before. So I remember saying to him, okay, well, what can we get you? Because it was unthinkable not to get them something. He said, tea would be fine. I went, okay, but tea, and he went, donuts? So we made him a huge pot of Earl Grey tea. We sent the girl out. She came back with a tray of 24 donuts, and because we didn't know how else to, He ate like one of them. We threw the rest away, I think, because nobody ate. So that was our trip. And I really got into it, and I started to know management, record companies. And that really impressed on me how lowly music journalists were on the totem pole. You had to play nice with them because, particularly with rock music, because in Britain in those days, you could not get a rock record played on the radio. You could not get a rock band on the television. And you fucking could not get them in the NME or Record Mirror, because by now it's all Post Pistols. I can't think who were big in the late 70s, but the real, you got the Fall on the cover of the NME, and I'm ringing them going, hey, Journey are in town next week. They're like, fuck off, you piece of shit. And because these music papers sold records, They really did. So without them, you couldn't have a career in the UK. You had to take them seriously. So they were despised, and they were treated like invaders, spies, not to be trusted, not one of us, because they weren't. I remember taking some guy from the NME to review Camel in Brighton, and he hated every fucking second. But I still take him backstage after the show, and we all make nice. And he writes this really shitty review in the NME about what a load of boring old farts they were, and what a fucking wanker the PR was trying to get on his good side. You know,
Yeah,
it's like you knew it was coming, but
yes. So before we go on, I mean, I definitely need us to close the loop on that cocaine story with the secretary from the PR firm, Mick.
She wasn't a secretary. She was a co-owner of the company.
Okay.
And what had happened was, in those days, I mean, I guess I was trying to explain that how far you would go to curry favour with the music press. So you hated them, but you had to treat them like gold. And so a favoured trick was, if you had an artist that you knew was not an easy sell, because they weren't new wave, you would do the coach trip. You'd hire a luxury bus and say, we're going to Birmingham, we're going to Brighton, we're going somewhere, and what's going to happen is we're going to get on the bus at 1 p.m, everybody's going to get fucking slaughtered because we're going to provide all the booze and all the drugs. We're going to go to the show, you won't even fucking remember the show, but then we'll be back on the bus, more booze, more drugs, and tomorrow you're going to write a fucking good review or you're never going to be on the bus again. And it worked every fucking time. So on one of these trips, it was to see Rory Gallagher at the NEC in Birmingham. And it was exactly as I described. It was tremendous fun, complete bacchanal. Don't forget, I was 20 years old at the time, and it was, you know, washing dishes, you know. So at the end of it, the bus always would end up in town in London. But in those days, there's no fucking Uber, there's no all-night trains or nothing. It's like, how are you going to get home? And this particular woman, one of the bosses, said to me, where do you live? And I told her, and she said, that's just up the road from me. Why don't I give you a lift back? I was like, fucking great, you know. So we're driving back about 2 a.m. We've seen Rory Gallagher, who, by the way, was absolutely amazing. And she said, oh, should we stop for a coffee at my place before I drop you off? I really wanted to go home, but do or die, right? So I went, oh, yeah, that'd be great. This is how I was. I mean, to me, it was grasp at any fucking straw. It led me to a lot of trouble and a lot of negative stuff for years, but it was all I had. And it wasn't just negative, but negative as well as positive. So we go in, and I want you to picture whatever cliche comes to your mind of the late 70s. I'm with a female representative that is a music mogul. Mm-hmm. And we go into her house, and man, it is white, I don't know what you call it, that thick shag carpet, white shag carpet, you know, you buried into your ankles when you stand on it.
Yeah. Gold
records all over the wall. And I'm like pretending I've seen, this is me every day, you know. Yeah. And she plays me an album that isn't due to be released for a few weeks by some superstar group. Did you hear the demos from Barbados? I'm like, yes. Listening to the demos, so, yeah, it's cool. Thinking, this is weird, you know. And then she pulls out a compact, you know, where you powder women, they would open it with a little mirror. And they do. She pulls out this, and she's gunk, 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 gunk. And again, I thought, oh God, not Speed, you know. She said, no, it's Coach. Oh no, it's Charlie. Charlie, okay. So I had a bit of that. She got out the brandy. I'm now completely out of my head. And it's about 4 a.m, and she says to me, these are her exact words. She says to me, right, now am I going to drive you home to mummy and daddy, or are you going to take me upstairs and fuck the arse off me? In my head, take me home to mummy and daddy, please. She was about 12 years older than me, which was a lot in those days. Mm-hmm. And she was not the most beautiful woman you've ever seen. And I went, I'm going to take you upstairs and fuck the arse off you. And so we went upstairs, and I'd had so much coke, which I'd never had before. And I so was not turned on. I couldn't get it up. Not get it up. So then I went, as a joke, an embarrassed joke, I said, it's a shame you don't have any, shame you don't have a vibrator. She went, open the drawer. Oh, no, oh, fucking hell, man. Anyway, this goes on for about 2 hours. Finally, she's satisfied. Uh-huh. And then she says, right, well, it's 6:30 in the morning. My husband will be home in a minute. I suggest you fuck off. So, I'm like, of course, absolutely. So at 6:30 in the morning, I totter down to the bus stop to wait for the first bus, completely out of my brain, utterly freaked out. And that's the woman that offered me the job for 12 weeks and blah, blah, blah.
So now, by then... Just quickly, mate, I mean, her husband's coming home at 6:30 a.m. What's he doing?
He was another famous music business person.
There you go. So he was out all night doing his thing. Fair enough.
Well, no, I think he was away and his flight got in, and it was, I didn't ask him. I knew who he was and what he did. Yeah. As soon as he probably wasn't coming home. It was just a way of getting rid of me, I just wanted to fucking leave, Yeah. And she wanted me to leave. So I left. I didn't get a lift. Not that I remember. So by the time I go to work for it, it's a couple of months later, and this is all forgotten. It's not forgotten, but it's never mentioned again. And I guess my point really was, I learned the music business doublethink through working at that place, which was, for music journalists, give them a good time all the time. Mm-hmm. And then get rid of them as quick as you can. Yeah.
And you actually went on to make partner at that PR firm as well.
I became a partner in about 6 months.
Okay. And
because I was good. Yeah. Guess what? I was good at talking shit and partying and being everybody's best mate. And it was the late 70s. I mean, I told you my dream was the Rolls Royce into the swimming pool. I remember I went from regional press to what they called the teeny mags, which was Jackie and True Love and Photo Secret Love and Boy Meets Girl and all that. They had loads of those magazines in the UK in those days. And they were just magazines for teenage girls, true life love stories, and will he ever see me again? But they would have pop columns in them.
Yeah.
And I used to take the pop writers out. I remember taking one to the Post Office Tower in London. In those days, I don't think you can now, but maybe you got a lift right up into the sky, and you sat in the restaurant. It was a revolving restaurant. It went round slowly so that you get the whole London skyline as you're having lunch. Mm-hmm. I remember being in there and chopping out lines of cocaine on a side plate because we were revolving. So at a certain point, your eye line there's no waiting. And so I was the fucking darling of all the teeny mags. Cocaine was a great entree into everything. And we always had loads of it wherever we went. And it became known as soon as I turned up, or one of the other people turned up, it's the fucking party starts now. Mm-hmm. And that's how we got loads of bands pressed that weren't popular. If they were a popular band, you didn't have to do that song and dance, but most of the bands you work on aren't popular. That's why they pay you money. And we would do things like, way before your time, in the days of vinyl records where albums would be 12 inches of plastic, we would tape, we get a gram of speed, depending on the journalist, if it was your regular common or garden music journalist, we would get a gram of speed and sellotape it inside the sleeve, you know, the old-fashioned LP sleeve, and bike it over to them for review. We never got one bad review when we did that. If it was the editor of the NME, I would say the NME, we never did it to the editor of the NME, but if it was an editor or a national newspaper music journalist, someone, you know, grab a Coke, biked over. One time we had a group playing in Edinburgh who had literally 5 minutes of punk fame in 78, and it's now 1980, and no one wants to fucking know. And I knew a music journalist who came from Edinburgh. And I said to him, you fancy a drink tonight? Yeah. He said, where do you want to go? I said, how about Tiffany's in Edinburgh? He went, what? I said, I'm sending over a motorbike right now. You and me, we're going to ride down to Heathrow. We're going to get on the shuttle. Because in those days, this is long before 9/11 and all that shit, it was like a bus. You'd get on that plane at Heathrow and they'd come round with a ticket machine and take the money off you for the ticket. So I said, we're going to, and the shuttle would go every 2 hours or something, every hour. So we're both on the back of motorbikes to Heathrow to make the 6 o'clock flight to Edinburgh, where by the time we arrived, we're pissed. The band come on, they're fucking useless, but we have a lovely time. And then we spend the night at his mum and dad's place in Edinburgh. And then the next morning, get the flight back to Heathrow, ready for go to work. What a great review he wrote, you know? I mean, yeah. And it's important to say, look, forget, it's like people used to talk about payola in the 50s. It makes you think like, oh, wow, that really was another time. I mean, yeah, it was another time. But if you think it's any different now, if you think music journalists are purists that could never be influenced, you know, mate, this is human fucking nature.
Yeah.
And I used to think, we used to plant stories in the Daily Mirror and the Sun that we'd sit there making them up, laughing our asses off, making them up. And they'd be in the Sun the next day. And I used to think, if it's so fucking easy for us to do this with rubbish pop music, what if you're a politician? What if you're an opinion shaper? What if you're one of the ruling elite that runs the fucking world? How easy is it for them? And so at that point, I completely gave up on believing anything I ever read in any newspaper.
Well, that's been amplified.
Except for those one bits that I do believe because they connect with things I already feel might be true, you know.
Yeah. Well,
the way of the world, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's an interesting point you make about politicians, especially in the 4 decades since. I mean, nowadays with the barriers to entry for content creation being so low with the internet and 4 million blog posts being published every single day, the amount of nonsense out there that is biased, either left-leaning or right-leaning, that goes on to influence and divide people. And
that's before you get to virtue signaling,
all that stuff,
culture.
Yeah.
I can't say him or her. I got to say they.
Oh, you've got to signal your gender pronouns, Mick. I can tell you're a male based on the video.
Well, I am right now, but any minute now I might change my mind.
Tomorrow you might identify as a dancing hyena.
Well, that was an early influence, obviously.
So the PR firm. So you were there for 6 months. You made partner, but you didn't. Obviously, now we know that you didn't spend the next few decades in PR and public relations. How long were you
just
there?
Under 2 years. Just under 2 years.
Why did you move on?
Why?
Yeah.
By the time I became a partner, me and my partner, he's dead now. His name was Joe O'Neill. He was a few years older. I'm 21. He's 25. Again, that's a significant gap at that age. He's been in the business obviously longer than me. He's the senior partner, and he's a coke fiend. Because in the late 70s, early 80s, everybody in the business was a coke fiend. You didn't say he's a coke fiend. You went, oh no, he's great. I mean, we would turn up for meetings, and it was like in those days everybody smoked. So you'd pull out your pack. If you first met someone, you'd pull out a packet of cigarettes and, would you like a cigarette? It was a very nice, socially welcoming thing to do. And we just took it to the next step with, we had a box of cigarettes on the table. You would help yourself, but we would also have a box of cocaine. And if we turned up at a meeting, we always brought cocaine, and we would bill the bands back. So on the invoice, it would say whatever you'd done that month and the expenses, and under expenses, it would say champagne and flowers for the band. And that was your cocaine bill. And that'd be often nearly always bigger than what you were charging them as a fee. But it nearly did always go with the bands, and just to keep the thing on the road. So with that in mind, by the time I become partner, every time he chops out a line, he chops out two and pushes the mirror over because we're both on the phone constantly. Same for me. And within a year, we had snorted our way through all of the profits into an enormous overdraft, into having our phones cut off because we couldn't pay the phone bill. We couldn't pay the £50 phone bill, but we've got 300 quid's worth of coke on the desk, which we go, these fucking phone people, they're fucking unreasonable. It got to a really bad place where he was really gone. I mean, he ended up seeing a psychiatrist. He started seeing creatures in his hands. Look, can you see it now? And you'd be going, yes, thinking, oh. And we'd be in meetings, with new clients, and you'd go, tell me something in the middle of, and then they'll be touring in October and the out. You go, yeah. Tell me something. Can you see any small white creatures in my hand? So I bailed out. I mean, I didn't bail out completely, but I started needing time off. Mm-hmm. A week here, a week there. And then I came back from 1 week off and the place had burned down.
What happened there?
Take a guess.
Insurance job.
You might say that. I can possibly comment.
Of course.
And I came in and I went, oh, fuck me, Joe. Really? And at that point, the jig was up. I couldn't. It was too fucking much. We've got police crawling all over the place. And I mean, it all paid out. And, so I made a career decision to go and become the dishwasher in a burger restaurant, which paid me £10.
Was that a tough? I mean, I guess
it was insanely tough. Yeah. It was insanely tough because I'm 22 at this point.
Yeah,
but given where I'd been, to turn up at 5:30 in the afternoon, having spent all day lying in bed fucking around with some chick or drugs or something, to sit at a big old sink. They get a bottle of white wine, open it and put it by the sink, and you'd be washing these dishes, and then you grab the wine, gum, 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 gum. On the fag breaks, you'd have a joint, because all the guys in there were young. They were all either younger than me or same age, and they were all starting bands or hoping one day to. And I just kept my fucking gob shut because you're not going to make any friends by going, oh, you've got a little band and you're hoping to get a deal. Yeah. Well, when I was on the road with Thin Lizzy, forget it. By then I'd also had every drug that was available to man, on a regular basis. And I just kept my gob shut. At the end of every night, they give you a £10 note. Mate, that to me, it was a joy after Have You Seen the Creatures in My Hand and burning the office down. And I would be sent off in a car to Thin Lizzy's office to sit in reception all day until they gave us a fucking check. Pitiful stuff. Yeah. I'm going to wash dishes. I'm going to chat up gorgeous waitresses, smoke a joint on my break, drink 1 or 2 bottles of wine, and a nice £10 note at the end of it. I mean, £10 40 years later is, I don't know what it is now, 30, 40, I don't know. But it was more than enough to get me through the next couple of days. And I'd do a couple of shifts like that a week, ended up doing 5. It was kind of a rehabilitation in some ways, because it was so far from what I'd just been doing. It kind of helped me get back to earth. But in the middle of a shift one night, I'm up to my fucking shoulders in dishwashing. There's a phone call. I go to the phone in the office, and it was the tour manager of Black Sabbath, who I've been working with. Dio had joined the group. I did the Heaven and Hell album, and got great press for it. And he said, a long story short, he just basically said, we're doing 2 nights at Madison Square Garden. We'd really like to bring some people out from the UK press, because we're coming back to the UK start of 81. Do you think you could get a bloke from the Melody Maker and a bloke from Sounds and fly out? And I said, I can, Paul. I said, but I've got no money. He said, don't worry. You'll have money. We'll get you money. So I did. I took a break from my new career as a dishwasher in a burger joint. It was a posh burger joint. It was like we have a burger and a bottle of wine, and the waitresses were all gorgeous, and we played music, and I flew to New York with Steve Gett from Melody Maker and Pete McCoskey from Sounds. I had £5 in my pocket when I arrived in New York. I had to get the boys to pay for the taxi into the hotel. When I got to the hotel, Paul Clark took me up to his suite, and he counted out a month's money. And in those days, we used to charge Black Sabbath £500 a month. And at that point in the US, the dollar, it was $2.6 for every pound. So £500 in US dollars turned into, what is that? I don't know.
1,300 US dollars? It's quite a bit at that time.
In cash. And I'm in the Waldorf Astoria in a suite. I've got 2 double beds in my suite and a coloured TV in the bog, and a chauffeur-driven limo for the weekend. And so that was really good. Can you imagine? I was walking around New York at a time when it was really dangerous, with $1,300 in cash in my pocket. I didn't even have a wallet or just in my fucking pocket.
This was shortly after the release of that film, The Warriors, which depicted all the turf wars that went on in Manhattan at the time.
It was a year later. Later.
Yep.
And it was really hairy, but I loved it. I'm in New York. And then I turned that 3-day trip into New York into a 2-week visit, because I lied and told, because again, that they loved British music journalists, because record companies had oodles of dough and nothing to spend it on. And so I got to see David Bowie in The Elephant Man by posing as a British music journalist. I got a year's membership to the Ritz Club, which I only used once. I interviewed Sam and Dave. I interviewed one of the Kinks. Then I flew to San Francisco to hook up with one of my all-time favourite groups in those days, Split Enz. I'd done a story on Split Enz. Oh, no. This is the story on Split Enz, right. So, I'd seen them play in the UK and reviewed them and just thought they were fantastic. So I met up with them in San Francisco, and they remembered me from that. And me and Neil Finn, our birthdays are like days apart. And we all just got on great. And so I stayed with them. We then went on to LA, and I wrote this big story, and they loved the story so much, they called me and said, would you like to write a book on us? And I went, yeah, no. What did I say? I went, I would love to do it. There's nothing more I would love to do.
Do or die.
never written a book in my life, no idea how to go about it. I said yes. And that was the beginning of me realizing the dishwashing gig might have to go. So I
difficult as it was to turn your back on the kitchen.
Yeah. I mean, I was really enjoying the dishwashing gig. I loved no responsibilities.
Yeah.
I mean, I ended up living with one of the waitresses a couple of years later. But I mean, I fucked a couple first, you know. I mean, it was just at certain points I was sleeping on the floor at the restaurant in the upstairs office and banging waitresses. I mean, with £10 in my pocket, you know. So
punching above your weight, mate. That's pretty good returns.
So, leaning on my PR connections, I called the editor at Sounds, who I'd given many of the time to, and just said, Alan, listen, I need a gig. Let me write something. He goes, well, I've got a lot of writers. And I said, Alan, where I've been in PR for 2 years, trust me, I know more about these people than any of your fucking writers. I don't care about punk. I don't care about the truth or the kids. Fuck the kids. Fuck all that. I just want to write some fantastic rock and roll stories. He said, done. And the first thing I did was Thin Lizzy, who I knew really well from the PR days. And it really just fucking took off. Suddenly, my first stint, I've been a low rung stringer. Occasional features, but, you know. Now I'm writing all the cover stories. And within a few months, I mean, I wrote about funk music, jazz, mainly rock, some punk. But then the rockabilly, Stray Cats came along and the rockabilly thing took off. And I loved all that. So now I'm the rockabilly guy. And I loved it because they were kind of punk in the sense that they were young and not old-fashioned. I mean, rockabilly, I mean, ultimately old-fashioned. But these were kids doing Stray Cats. I mean, I was in Berlin with the Stray Cats. We had a fantastic time. I remember the tour manager came into the dressing room. I'm in the dressing room. He comes in before the show and he literally goes, there's 3 of them and me, right? So he comes in, he's got a handful of grams of coke and he goes to the band, he goes, 1 for you, 1 for you, 1 for you, and 1 for you, me. Gunk. Yeah. So not quite punk, but with all the edge of that world, but these American guys and coke is, can you imagine being with Paul? I knew Paul, I didn't know him. I met him a few times in those days. Miserable, boring, judgmental, fucking anal cunt, right? No one fucking liked him. No one still likes him except the people with their heads up his ass. Imagine going, Paul, 1 gram of coke for you, 1 for you, Bruce Foxton. You know, they'd be like, oh no, that's rockist. No, we are, you know, fuck off, you know, give it to me. So loved all that. And then I couldn't get a job on the staff at Sounds. And lazy fuck that I was sharing a flat with Sandy Robertson, who was a fantastic writer. He was a fair few years older than me, and I learned so much. You know, before I shared a flat with Sandy, if I was writing, like I told you, I'd be writing and rewriting and, you know, Sandy would I used to write notes and then I would type, and Sandy put a piece of fucking paper in that typewriter and he'd go, he's Scottish. He's sitting, Mick, bash that shite out. And he'd go, brrr, there's your feature. I go, fuck me, man. That's, you know, so next thing, I'm bashing the shite out. And of course, it's like uncorking the dam or something. It says, whoosh. And had a great time. But he is getting, every month, he gets this lump sum of dough. I'm so jealous. Next thing, Virgin Records have a job going as a press officer. And after heavy publicity, I got offered jobs with all the major record companies because I was known as that great PR. You know, if he can get PR for Black Sabbath and Journey, imagine what he could do with the Human League and Japan and Culture Club, you know. So Virgin offered me a job and it was more money than Sandy was getting. I just went, I'll take it. And it should have been a perfect job. It was a great time to be at Virgin. But by that time, me and Sandy were deep into what we used to call Henry, as in Henry the horse, as in the gear that makes you queer, as in the, are you going to take some smack, or are you the most enormous bender I've ever met in my life? I mean, obviously said with a certain amount of irony and postmodern non-PC humor, but nevertheless, and that was the thing where my values and my do or die and everything, that just went out the fucking window, because it does with that drug. The minute you become addicted, you know, all the game is over. There's only one way it's going to go, and it's either going to go there real quick or real slow. And I eventually got sacked from Virgin. I'd been there about 8 months, and I got 9 months when I got sacked. And I got sacked because I was a junkie.
Yeah.
They didn't say that. They said we've had a number of complaints from managers of bands. And then the conversation moved on to that. And that was pretty devastating. Because actually I just got clean. I had just got clean. I'd just gone through the cure for the second time. And I was in that good place. And I was working hard and things were happening. But the overlap, you know, it caught up with me. Yeah. So that was a bad scene. But so I signed on, moved into another flat in Acton with some other lunatics, and Flexi Pop, which was a new magazine that did purely pop music, but it used to come with, way before your time, there used to be a thing called a Flexi disc. Flexi disc.
Okay. I was born in 83, Mick, so.
Okay, so this is a year before you were born.
Okay.
And flexi discs, you could sometimes the NME or someone would put one on their cover as a giveaway once a year or something.
Yep.
And you took it off, and it was literally this thin shit bit of plastic. You put it on your turntable, and in the most crackly, appalling way, it would play some music. So they built a magazine around it and called it Flexi Pop. And they needed writers, and in their stupidity, they rang me. And because I was a good writer, I mean, all those stories I'd done for Sounds, on front cover after front cover after front cover, everybody got the full music papers in those days. Everybody, especially if you're in the biz, and if you're in the pop magazine business, you always got to see what everybody else was doing. So I was very well known in that world at that point. They didn't know I'd turned into the junkie from hell. They just knew me from those days. I realised I hadn't seen my name for a while and thought, oh, shall we ring him? He could be good. And so it was good for a few months. What I said to them was, I go to my local pub every night. They've got a jukebox, and they keep it pretty up to date. So whatever is the most popular song on the pub jukebox, why don't I do a story on that group that week? And they went, yeah, all right. And so I was doing stories on Bucks Fizz, which you've never heard of, Dollar, which you've never heard of. These are like boy and girl bands, you know.
Of the early 80s.
You'll have to Google Bucks Fizz, Dollar, Imagination. Oh, Duran.
Well, I know Duran. Of course, we know Duran. I'm looking up Bucks Fizz right now, and they definitely look like. Well, they're a British version of ABBA, because that's what they kind of look like to me.
Yes. They're like a very poor man's British version of ABBA. Poor man's
ABBA. Okay. On the same page now. Fantastic.
But they had a few number one records. And I got a great kick. After years of working with album bands and writing that kind of stuff, and listening to that kind of... By now, I mean, I've left it. I'm into Weather Report and Chick Corea. And, I mean, jazz was really always my thing in terms of being a fan. So for me, it was wonderful kind of yin-yang, where I was taking mescaline and listening to Weather Report, where the music would come out of the speakers and undulate around me and give me visions of God. And then the next day going off to interview Bucks Fizz about their new single, I Love You, You Love Me, Oh How Happy We Will Be, you know. Yeah. But hanging out with these two blonde birds, obviously no fucking talent whatsoever, but pretty and blonde and fun. I didn't have to pretend I liked their fucking album or their new song about the meaning of life was great, because they didn't write songs. They barely sang. I mean, you know, they just look good. What's not to like? So that was pretty good. But then, unfortunately, I relapsed and got back into the bad one.
Henry.
Henry, yeah. And then, beginning of '83, this was do or die. I knew if I didn't stop, I was going to die. Not just like physically, but my life is over. You know, that guy I mentioned from Mount Olympus, the great mentor. I remember he rang me one night and said, "Do you want to come down the pub?" And the pub, it was 5 minutes walk from where I was, and I wouldn't go. Because when you're on heroin, you can't drink alcohol, and when you're deep, you don't want to be sitting in a crowded room with people having a good time. You know, it's just your idea of hell. But I remember in turning him down, it really brought it home to me how fucking terrible my life had become, how I had become, what a cunt I was. So at that point, I took the third cure, and this time it took a long time, but I stuck with it. I stuck with that motherfucker. And then the thing that really saved me was I met a girl, and she'd never done heroin in her life. In fact, she was a speed freak. I didn't know that at first. She was just incredibly good looking. She was Greek. And, you know, you talk about the perfect 10. She was the perfect 11. 10. She was. Man, she went all the way to 11. Filthy as fuck. I mean, I remember being in a call box ringing someone in the middle of the afternoon, and she got down and gave me a blowjob while I'm ringing, you know, the dole office to get my benefits or whatever the fuck it was, you know. I mean, that was a trip. But she was an art student at St. Martin's. And she just led me a merry dance. And then, you know, she ended up fucking all these guys at art college, by which time I'm back doing dishes. I'm working for a catering agency because I don't want to go back to music journalism. I'm reading Henry Miller. You know, I'm reading Tropic of Cancer. I want to be in Paris in the 40s and 30s, penniless, but writing immortal prose by night, you know. So that's what I'm doing. But in order to earn a buck, I'm working for a catering agency under an assumed name because I'm also signing on. So because I'm working under an assumed name, I've lied to them and told them I've been in Australia for a couple of years, and that's why I have no social security. And don't forget, no computers. It would take months to find the right card. And they're an agency. Who can be fucked? Send the cunt out and just get the money in.
That's it.
But it meant I was always on what they called emergency tax because I had no tax code. So I was always paying far more tax than I should. The idea being when your tax code comes through, you get a rebate. But I knew it never would because I was under tax code. I was working as a guy that didn't exist. So I'm doing this and kind of getting off on it, thinking, you know, I'm a wild one. I'm a wild gypsy boy. I'm writing my fucking... I'd applied to be a mature English student.
The University of London?
Yeah, Queen Mary's College, which was very weird because a couple of years ago, my oldest daughter, one of the colleges she looked at was Queen Mary's in London, and I went with her. I never did that in the end, but and I'm working at Heathrow Airport. I remember I was working at Heathrow Airport doing the 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. shift. I'm washing the pots and pans, and they're gigantic for the food they make, for the shit you eat on the plane. And so it's all mass produced. A lasagna thing is like, it's literally 4 feet deep. And it was a 24-hour shift, 7 till 3, 3 till 10, 10 till 7. It was 24 hours. So whatever time you turned up on whatever shift, there was always literally a mountain of these giant, filthy, disgusting pots with sinks that would go from your ankles to your chest, and you'd be up to your shoulders with a scouring brush for 8 hours, leave, come back, sane. I've still got a little scar on my head where one of these things fell and hit me. So I'm doing all this. Meantime, she started her mature student art course at St. Martin's, and she's hanging out with, this is now 1983, so you've come along.
I've come along.
Whole fucking world has changed.
Oh, yeah.
You guys have come along and turned it into the 80s. And she's sitting around. I've come home from Heathrow Airport, fucking shattered after 8 hours of giant pots and pans. And I could tell she was ashamed of me, because she'd be sitting around with Sebastian and fucking Alexander and Julian. And they're all talking about, just got back from the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. It was amazing. Yeah. Thinking about going to New York next year. Have you seen my painting? Oh, what do you do? I'm at Heathrow Airport doing pots and pans, But I'm a writer, really. Oh, okay. Yeah. And I could see it not working in her eyes. And so because of that, I remember I had to go under the bed to find my old contacts book. She was a filthy motherfucker, man. She would pull her tampons out so you could fuck her and throw them under the bed, and they would just stay there. So I got my arm under the bed looking for my old contact book. Found it, rang a couple of people up, and Time Out magazine, which was a great magazine, I knew someone there, and he said, you could do a little interview. We've got this guy, there's this new group. Have you heard of them? They're called The Smiths. I went, yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'd actually seen them, and they had their first single out. They said, could you interview their singer? It's just on the phone, I'm afraid. Nothing was on the phone in those days unless it was, had to be. I went, that's fine. I said, what's his name? He said, Morrissey. I went, well, that's his first name? I went, that's all we've got, Morrissey. So I'm on the phone to this guy, and I go, so what's your name? I said, what's your proper name? He went, Morrissey. I went, no. He went, Stephen. I said, all right, Stephen. Right. So, and I asked him, he started talking about Coronation Street and the North, and I was like, this guy's a bit of a fucking loser. But so am I. So we had a bit of a laugh. I wrote the thing, they published it, looked really lovely. But at the same time, I'd run Malcolm Dome, who was now on this new thing called Kerrang magazine.
Yeah.
And I said, what are you looking for?
Out of Sounds magazine, right?
Yeah. I mean, I was there when Kerrang was invented. How it came about was in Sounds in 1981, I'm now... I started writing about heavy metal. Not because it was my favourite music or anything like that. It was an opportunity. No one would touch it. So I came in. Alan had said to me, look, you can do Thin Lizzy. We really need someone to cover the rock stuff. I went, done. So, and then in the other corner was Eric Fuller and Vivian Goldman, and they always did reggae. And then there was Gary Bushell, who was writing about punk, what used to be known as Oi. Oi, oi! Yeah, the Exploited...
Sham 69.
Yes, Sham 69.
Yeah,
absolutely. So in those days, if you rang Sound, you went to a switchboard and they just pushed it through to whoever picked up. So in order to sort of as a joke, but it also was useful to let whoever was ringing, let them know what part of the office they had arrived in, Eric Fuller, who was very posh but covered reggae, would answer the phone. He'd go, "Bom bom padiddly," because he would be like, "Oh, bom bom padiddly, guns in a Brixton." I and I. He's that kind of guy. Rastafari. So he'd pick up the phone and go, "Bom bom padiddly," and if Gary Bushell answered the phone, he would go, "Oi oi." And as a joke, me and Pete Mikowski, because he was there, if we answered the phone, we would go, "Danang," or "Kalang," or we started to settle on Kerrang!
Mm-hmm.
Or it could be dang, just dang. And so when the idea of doing a one-off, what should we call it? Just, why don't we call it Kerrang! Everybody went, that's a terrible fucking name. Oh, no, you can't call it that. Let's call it that. And it was just a colour pull-out in the magazine.
That's funny. I always thought the Kerrang, or at least I believe I read this somewhere, was the sound a guitar makes when you go Kerrang. Is that?
Yeah, well, that's what we used to do. Like we used to go dang.
All right. Yep.
Kerrang! And then Kerrang! Kerrang! It was just to let them know you'd got through to the rock guys.
Mm-hmm.
And if you got oi oi, you were doing the punk stuff with Gary. You've got bom bom ba diddly. You'd got through to the reggae part of the office.
Makes sense.
It was just so. 2 years later, whatever it is, Malcolm, who I'd facilitated his first ever interview for the music press. He's now on Kerrang. So I rang him and I said, are you looking for anything? He said, yeah, I'm having a tough time. We're trying to get an interview with Yes. Yes had just released a 90125 album with Owner of a Lonely Heart. And I went, oh, I know those guys. He said, do you? I said, yeah, leave it with me. Now ask me, did I know those guys?
Of course not.
So
anybody listening by now, listening to 2 hours into this conversation, knows the answer to that question, Mick.
Although I did know one of them, the guitarist Trevor Rabin. And I knew Trevor this much because he had produced the first Wild Horses album in 1980. And Wild Horses was a group I did PR for. Wild Horses were formed by Brian Robertson after he got fired from Thin Lizzy and Jimmy Bain after he got fired from Rainbow. Mm-hmm. And they formed a group called Wild Horses. And I did their press for 18 months. And again, we all got on amazingly. Me and Robbo were close to being the same age. And I'd always loved Thin Lizzy. So I literally dug out thinking, oh, there's no way. I rang this number and Trevor picked up. And I said, Trevor, do me a favour, blah, 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 blah. He went, yeah, fine. I said, right. He said, I'm in London. I said, okay, well, I'll come over. So I went over. I took my girlfriend, my Greek art student.
The filthy girlfriend.
/ filthy brothel queen, speed freak, with me. She brought a camera. And he's sitting on his bed while I'm interviewing him. And she's literally crawling all over it in this really short skirt. Like, I can't show you, but, like thighs spread. And she's like, oh, Trevor, oh, that's magnificent. Oh, yeah, more baby. He's just like this, Nearly got the old fella out, Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, I realised my ancient tape recorder isn't fucking working. So I said, you got any paper? I borrow a pen and paper and I try and write down what he's saying.
Yeah.
Anyway, I didn't have a typewriter. We had to borrow one which had most of the keys missing. So as I'm typing, there's no key. There's just that jagged. You've never used a typewriter.
Oh, I have used a typewriter. Back in my single-digit years, I think we had one in the house.
Well, imagine, the A, C, that they're gone. It's just the jagged spikes.
Yeah.
I remember I walked to the local pub, bought 2 pints of Guinness, came back. She was growing grass plants, so I rolled up a couple of that into joints and sat there, ow, 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 from these notes I couldn't read, and wrote this story. And they ran it. And they didn't run any of her pictures, which I was fucking thrilled about. And then Trevor Rabin started ringing her to see if she'd go on a date with him, which she swore she never did. Anyway, and so then I had a choice between trying to keep pushing with Time Out or become a new writer on Kerrang. And I knew where the money would come. I knew Time Out was the prestige gig. I would have, at the time, that would have suited me very nicely. Mm-hmm. The trouble with the very, very cool magazines is that everybody wants to write for them. And although I had friends there and there was a trickle of work, it was prestigious, but it wasn't enough to give me a living.
Sure.
And Kerrang at that time, as it kind of remained, but was mostly, you know, kids that were music enthusiasts. They were first and foremost heavy metal fans. And so it was, I'm not going to say a fanzine, but it was very, very coming from a very big fan point of view. It wasn't overly critical. Had a great deal of humor and heart, because these people really did love and know about the stuff they were covering. But it was like a football team that lacked a star player. You know, a football team that was one division below the Premiership. You know, the top division.
So does that make you the proverbial George Best, Mick, when you joined Kerrang?
That makes me the proverbial George Best. Although, I mean, George Best, to carry that analogy, George Best was 17 when he made his debut. I was a bit more like, you know, that star player you buy in his mid-20s when he's already proved himself, but maybe he got a fine for something or fell out with someone and he had to leave.
So a bit like Cristiano Ronaldo joining Real Madrid after falling out with Alex Ferguson.
Yeah, or Eric Cantona, I think. You
Indeed.
know, joining Man United when everybody else had just had enough of him. I mean, that was very much me. And I saw that, and I just weighed up the possibilities and just what would be more fun, what would give me more money. And Kerrang, it just so happened that at that moment, coincidentally, Jeff Barton, who'd been my reviews editor on Sounds magazine, going back to when I wrote for them, it just so happened that Kerrang had gone from this one-off to this monthly, to this thing that came out every 2 weeks. Eventually it would go to weekly. It was 2 weeks when I got there, and they had just made Jeff the new editor because it was becoming much more professional, and they needed that kind of, you know, they needed that sort of person to run the ship. And he'd been there about a week, and I just had my second piece published. And he just rang me up and asked me to go for a drink. And he just said, look, if you come and do this, you know, really give it a go. His actual words were, the sky's the limit. Because we don't have any, you know, real good writers. We have really good, enthusiastic people that are funny. But, you know, there's no one that kind of breaks out of that can write. So I was obviously pleased. And I was like, yeah, I'm the guy. So I was the guy for about 6 weeks, and then I had a bad breakup with my girlfriend, and I vanished for about 3 months. And when I came back, I was like, you said the sky was the limit. He said, yeah, and then you vanished for 3 months. And I'm like, oh, give us another chance, you know. And so he gave me another chance, and I just threw myself into it. And they were really magical days on Kerrang. 1984, 1985, when it was used to come out every 2 weeks. You know, you would have 2 weeks to make that magazine fantastic. And there was only a very, very small crew that worked on it. And we just put a lot of love into it. And I'd have to be able to show you an old issue to show you what I mean, but this is pre-computers. Everything is done by hand. The old design method with tracing paper and pens and projectors, and we just had that extra little bit of headspace where we would add tiny things, hand draw little squiggles and stuff you wouldn't. It was like, you know, that great thing about The Simpsons where it works on different levels. Yeah. If you go into the minutiae, you go, oh, look, oh, you know. And I mean, for instance, we had someone doing a column which we called Wimp Wire, and that was covering the melodic rock scene. And so we called it Wimp Wire, which just made us laugh, you know. But then you wouldn't notice. Some people never notice at all. But that column, those 2 pages every issue, down one side, the designer used to hand draw a little mouse eating cheese right at the bottom right-hand corner. And then at the top right-hand corner, there was a guillotine. And each issue, it would get a tiny bit lower. And then eventually came the day when it chopped the mouse's head off.
That was Kerrang's Mad Magazine fold-out moment.
Absolutely. But there were loads of things like that. There was a gossip column called View from the Bar, because Kerrang, because it was at that point, it was the only heavy metal magazine in the world. And heavy metal, as we've discussed before, had no profile whatsoever in the UK, not even in the music press, other than Kerrang. So whenever there was a show on, whether a big show or a club show, usually a small show, because we'd be out every night, but they would just put the whole magazine on the guest list. And it just became, the Kerrang guys are here.
So just on that, Mick, I mean, I know in the 80s, it was a totally different music industry to what it is today. And record companies ultimately had no one else to spend money on other than press. And like you said, Kerrang were the only game in town, especially in the UK when it came to heavy metal press. And so if there was a tour over in the United States, they'd basically pay you guys to fly out and join the bands on their US legs of the tour and drum up publicity for the UK leg. I imagine this would have, I mean, you always had a sort of hard, raging sort of lifestyle. I mean, we've already talked about your dabbling with heroin and everything else, but I imagine your lifestyle would have gone from 10 to 11 in the 80s after you joined Kerrang.
Yeah, it did. In ways I could not have imagined. It was very freeing, as we say these days, because, I always felt I had the misfortune to begin my writing career just as punk. I think the same month I had my very, very first review published was the same month Never Mind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols came out. And I loved the Sex Pistols. I didn't like the Clash, loved the Damned, didn't like the Jam. I was only 19, so I was into all that stuff. But I've been a music fan for a long time, and like I said before, my idea of a very big punk thing back in those days was hate America, hate any visible sign of success or hippiedom, and I'm like, no, that's what I came in for. And suddenly catapulting into the world of Kerrang in the mid-80s was kind of like the next best thing, because they were all about, who is the most successful rock band, who lives the most lavish, outrageous lifestyle. Lemmy, Dio, Ozzy. It was just a world populated by these fantastic characters. And so I was able to finally enjoy and celebrate limousines and private planes and chicks and party. It was like that. I mean, Kerrang itself was, when I think back, my God, because it came out every 2 weeks, and because there were literally only 4 or 5 of us that were in the office every day, I used to share a table with Malcolm Dome and a designer, Crusher Jewel, and we used to have a bottle of mezcal just on the table between us every day.
Every day, I was going to ask.
And then at the end, me and Crusher would split the worm, But at the same time as this, I would turn up to work with 6 cans of lager. I say turn up to work, we'd roll in about 11, because we'd have been out till 2 in the morning. And it just was a constant atmosphere like that. Yeah, the first Christmas, all the record companies would send bottles of champagne and Christmas cards and all kinds of stuff.
Was it, what kind of champagne, man? Was it top shelf or?
Do you know? I don't know, Steve, because
you guys didn't drink champagne.
Well, we did. We did. We used to get sent bottles of champagne all the time, It probably was good stuff, because record companies, all they do is in those days, they just phone, whoever they normally use to send champagne to their musicians, their artists.
Mm-hmm.
So it would have been one of those. I'm sure it would have been very good, but it was treated like fucking mouthwash. I mean, we just pop, 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 guzzle, guzzle, guzzle. No glasses, no paper cups, just straight down the neck. One for you, bottle for me, But that's what it was like. I can remember getting the new issue and lying in bed at night and reading it and laughing so much that, I nearly had a fit. The stories were funny, the pictures were funny, but it was the tone. It was all these extra little things we used to throw in, these in-jokes, and it kind of built to fever pitch, and you either kind of got it or you didn't.
Yeah.
And so how did you go about balancing that with the lifestyle you were living, like the creativity of actually writing good stuff with a good tone that was funny and everything else? Meanwhile, turning up to work at 11 in the morning, hungover from the last night with a sixer and getting stuck into some champagne while you're at it.
Well, you can do anything in your 20s, can't you? I mean, I can remember sitting there at the typewriter with the sweat just trickling down my back, and realizing my hands were shaking so much I could barely type. And you would run. We were literally in an office above Covent Garden tube station, and if you looked out of the window, we were on the first floor. If you looked out the window, there were literally two pubs opposite each other on the corner, and I would go down to the pub. And if they needed me, no mobile phones, if they needed me, they'd open a window, go, Mick, there's so-and-so on the phone. I'm like, oh, tell them I'll be up in a minute,
Mm-hmm.
So you just did. I mean, I remember sometime about a year into it, I had a new girlfriend, and I would go visit her, and I'd always turn up with lots of beer, and she said to me one day, she said, when was the last time you didn't have a drink, had a day without a drink? And I couldn't think. I mean, I was quite affronted by the question, because it had never occurred to me that you might have a day without a drink. Why would you do that, Mm-hmm. So different times. And I can remember sitting in LA interviewing, I can't even remember the name of the band now. I can picture them. But sitting there and hurting so bad, just my head pounding and the sweat pouring off me while I listened to them telling me how great their new album was, I think also because by then I'd worked in PR, I'd worked in management, I'd worked with a lot of really famous bands, but I'd worked with them not as a journalist, but as one of the team. And you see people, people are just people, whether they're in a famous group or whether they're just, walking down the street. People are just people. You get used to them real fast. And so by the time I got to Kerrang, Iron Maiden were all my age. Def Leppard were all about my age. Bon Jovi were a tiny bit younger. Guns N' Roses were a tiny bit younger. So it wasn't like I would have been when I was 18 if I'd met David Bowie or something. I'm now 25, 26, and I'm meeting groups that, I've been in the business longer than they have. I've done more things than they have. It must have been brilliant to be Iron Maiden in 1984, but would they have known what it was like to ride around in the back of a limo with Thin Lizzy in the late 70s? No. Would they know what it'd be like to be on a 3-day bender with Ozzy? No. I mean, I could go on, So I didn't feel, I felt like a pig in shit is what I felt like. And I was the biggest pig in the most shit that I could find. And I wasn't married. I had no kids. I'd come out of this bizarre relationship with drugs and with weird women. And men, not, friends, weird friends. Mm-hmm. And so I was ready, baby. I'm ready to go. What the fuck? And I used to write fast. I didn't write for any kind of literary purpose. I wrote to entertain. And I look back at some of that stuff. Well, very occasionally someone will send me a clipping. I hear the podcast, and we did the Donington podcast. People started sending me cuttings of things I wrote from that show. And it's exactly as I described it, these short reviews that if you look at them, you can tell basically I was blitzed out of my mind. I had no idea what the fuck I was talking about. But it was fun. You know, we didn't have any strategy. I mean, by 1990, Kerrang got bought by EMAP, and EMAP had smash hits, Mojo, Q, Select magazine, loads of very high-profile music-related magazines. And the first time we went into the office, their publishers came in and wanted to discuss the cover with Jeff, the editor. And they were like, and so why this cover? Why have you chosen that group? Which demographic are you aiming for? And we had no fucking idea what they were talking about. We were going, yeah, but it's Chainsaw Massacre. The album's great. So, I mean, we're just putting them on the cover. And they'd go, well, wouldn't it be better to put, you know, Bon Jovi on the cover? And we go, yeah, and we will when we feel like it. You know, we didn't have that head for business.
Yeah.
And yet the magazine, the popularity rocketed, particularly after it went weekly. I mean, there was a time, Kerrang started as a tiny one-off. One of the reasons we got left alone so long was it wasn't considered that we were like on a rolling weekly contract where it could just end at any second. It was never, ever, ever launched. It had no strategy or marketing. It wasn't something, they didn't roll it out like a new magazine should be. They didn't launch it. They didn't promote it. It was just a piece of flibbity, bibbity, dibbity stuff that drunk people did in that weird office in the corner. And yet it finally overtook Sounds magazine, which at one point had been the biggest selling music weekly in the country. Not only did it overtake it, but by like 90 something or other, they closed Sounds down. Melody Maker, they closed it down. NME, we started to outsell the NME, which was just insane. And then they started launching it around the world. And by then there was Metal Hammer and loads of different rock-related titles. And in America, there were magazines that tried to do the same thing. There was Faces magazine in New York. I used to do stuff for them. Rip magazine in LA. I used to do stuff for them. But they were all kind of mini-me Kerrang magazines. And they didn't work in the same way because they thought it was about the music. They thought it was about the groups. They didn't realize that was your base. That was your baseline. That was your reason to be there. But once you were there, it really wasn't about that stuff at all. It was about the humor, the wit, the knowledge. And you got to know these people. You know, we used to, every single writer and photographer got turned into a kind of a caricature so that the readers could, we became like avatars. So that when I was writing these stories, it was very much written as if one of the readers was doing that journey. And it was written for them. And it was written to entertain them and make them laugh. And, you know, one of the things that used to be said about me was, you know, as a criticism was, does he ever mention the music, you know? And the answer was, well, if I fucking have to. But I mean, I've always thought, well, you can buy the music, you can listen to the record. That isn't, what can I give you that you can't get? And what I could give you was getting in the room with these people, seeing them when they had food all over their face and something embarrassing had happened. Obviously, there was a serious side to it, but it was just, I remember when, I don't know if you guys ever in the 90s got Loaded magazine or that kind of lad culture. Well, James Brown, who started Loaded, I mean, he used to be an enormous Kerrang fan. And he used to talk to me about it all the time and used to laugh at it. And so these ideas were kind of a little ahead of their time in that regard because it was completely non-PC. at a time when PC was in its infancy. So, you know, Enemy, Melody Maker Sounds, these were arbiters of good taste. You know, you could feel comfortable and cool be sitting on a train reading a copy of the NME. But you wouldn't want to be sitting on a train brandishing Kerrang magazine with, I don't
Lucky
know.
Lawless on the cover.
Yeah, exactly. Carcass and their new album, you know. And it became shameless in that regard. We used to laugh at the others and take the piss. And as we know, I mean, it's now the longest surviving physical music weekly in the UK, which is very great.
37 years later. And it sounds like you guys just had this sort of creative freedom to just be playful, because it wasn't seen as much as a case of, say, Strictly Business, like Mojo, like NME, like Rolling Stone. It was this rolling magazine where you guys didn't know when this roller coaster would end, so let's just enjoy the ride, so to speak.
Exactly. You've absolutely hit the nail on the head. I remember someone saying to me at one point, you know, I realized it'd been 5 years or something. And it just seemed absurd. I mean, I can remember sitting in LA where I was pretty much domiciled at this point in '89, Christmas, and just kind of saying to people, where is this going? Because it was '89 going into '90, and a lot of people were around, and I kept kind of saying, you know, what is the meaning of all this? Because I've got to the stage where, you know, you're at the party so long, eventually you really do want to just go home. And I'd kind of reached that point, and yet I didn't have a home to go to. And so it was almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy when I kind of crashed out of it. You know, people go about Guns N' Roses. Again, that was the symptom. It wasn't the cause or the illness. The clash with Axl was just the latest in a long line of me not giving a shit and making it obvious, you know, that you can not give a shit and have a lot of fun. But when it's, I mean, how long was I? I was about there 8 years in the end. And I was heartily sick of the whole thing by then. And it started to show. Yeah. You know, the interview I did with Axl was completely straight up. I mean, he rang me. He asked me to go to his place. It was the early hours of the morning. I recorded everything. I still have the cassettes. There was a witness. We did 3 different interviews that night. One for the radio show I was doing, and other bits and pieces, and it was all good. But the surrounding. And then when he blew up about the interview, that was really the kind of excuse to deal with me. What had really been going on was I was beyond caring, and I just couldn't get my act together. So I remember there was a group called Little Angels, British group. They came like a mini Def Leppard, and they came to LA, and I spent the day with them, a couple of days with them. I interviewed them. I wrote a great story for Kerrang. The only thing I didn't do was the show they did in LA. I didn't go to it because I went out for dinner with David Coverdale instead, which at the time seemed much more fun to me than going to some group I didn't really feel were going to make it. Lovely people. I thought, well, they've had me for 2 days. I'm writing the fucking story. Why do I need to go and bang my head at the gig, you know, when I could be going out for dinner with David? So there were things like that, and it rubbed people wrong because they weren't in that space. By then, Kerrang had more people on the staff, people that hadn't been there in the dancing on the desks and drinking 12 bottles of champagne days. They hadn't been there for any of that. Computers had come in, and you know, it was a different. EMAP had bought the magazine. It was a very different transition, and I just wasn't in that realm. I was in LA by then. I was writing for tons of different magazines. I was doing TV and radio and all this business. And I can't. From their point of view, I've grown too big for my boots. And from my point of view, they were all little people that didn't understand, you know. So so there you go. So that was
on the clash with Axl, Mick. I mean, obviously,
I knew you'd get me back to that.
Of course. I mean, I couldn't let you get off the hook that easily. Of course, what you're referring to there is that famous interview you did for Kerrang in the early 90s, in which Rose threatened to harm Vince Neil of Motley Crue, of course, after an
The
incident.
actual words were, I want to smash his plastic face.
Yep.
Guns or knives, motherfucker. I don't care whichever way you want to go.
Yeah. And then Vince Neil caught wind of this, came out in the press and said, I'll meet you, I'll fight you anywhere, anytime. And from what I understand, Axl basically never fronted up and claimed that his crew held him back when an opportunity arose backstage at an event to fight Vince Neil. But
well, you've nearly got it right. Let me prove this one out, okay? It sparked from the American Music Awards ceremony where Axl got up and sang with Tom Petty, and Motley Crue were also there getting some award, and Izzy was there. And what had happened was Izzy had been fucking Vince Neil's. Was she his wife? I don't know if she was his wife at that point.
Was it Charisse?
Charisse, the mud wrestler from the Tropicana.
Good mud wrestler.
The best mud wrestler from Tropicana. And classy act. And so Vince had run over. And Vince, this is a tough Mexican street kid in LA, from East LA. Exactly the kind of dude you do not want to get into a fight with unless you also happen to be a tough Mexican kid from the barrio or you're carrying a gun. So Vince runs over, wallops Izzy, and Axl, runs over to help his best bud in all the world. And the bodyguards intervened. Now, Axl, in Izzy's own words to me, was just a little guy. I mean, he had a big brain and a big voice and a big attitude, but I mean, this is not a fighter. You could, I mean, tiny, skinny, hunched up little Quasimodo, red hair. This is a guy, one punch, he's going to run away crying. Not Vince. So Axl's being held back, And then he reads about it in Kerrang, and whatever the report was in Kerrang, it didn't get it quite right. So he rings me up about midnight one night in LA. Get over here, I got something I want to say, yada, yada, yada. And so when I came to transcribe the interview, I could see how heavy it looked on the page. I mean, these days, post-social media where haters are abundant and we all slag each other off, that didn't exist. To have someone in a magazine offering to meet someone and beat the shit out of them, this was a big story. I mean, the national newspapers picked it up here in the UK. The Sun took my interview and ran it as a 3-day world exclusive, for which I sued them. It took a year, but I got money out of them. I wouldn't repeat the process. It was a complete bad move in terms of time and effort in all the wrong places. But it was a big interview. And as I'm typing this thing up, I'm going to smash that fucker's face, blah, blah, blah. I thought, this looks really heavy. So I rang him and I recorded this conversation as well. And I still have this conversation. And I just said, look, I'm sitting here writing this and it just looks really heavy. He said, well, read me some. And so I read him some of the worst parts. And he was laughing. And then he said, and I quote, he said, I stand by every motherfucking word. Print it. So we did. And 3 days after the magazine came out, his publicist called me and told me Axl didn't believe he'd said those things. And it turned into, you can imagine how I took this information. It had just been a few months before that they'd been asking me if I would have Slash stay at my home in England so he could come off heroin. I was going to introduce him to the private doctor that I knew had helped many people.
Mm-hmm.
And that wasn't available at that moment in America. It would have meant going into a big rehab treatment center and spending a load of money, whereas this was much more discreet, a private doctor in London, There were all kinds of things I never wrote about. There were all kinds of things I still have never written about and won't, because they were very personal, and many things. And so to be that guy, and they were giving me gold records. I've got GNR Lies on the wall next to me here right now with my name on it. To go from that guy to being he didn't say those things, you made it up. I mean, I lost my fucking mind. I then offered to fight him, and of course that didn't pan out.
Didn't Don King want to promote a fight between Axl and Vince, and Alice Cooper came out and said he'd fight the winner?
Yeah, Don King was my big boxing promoter from Ali to Tyson and onwards.
Yeah,
he offered to promote the fight, and Vince was up for it, but not Axl. I mean, fuck's sake, never in a million years. This is the Phantom of the Opera.
Yeah. Well, they probably missed out on a big payday. I mean, nowadays you've got YouTube stars like Logan Paul fighting Floyd Mayweather for millions of dollars.
No, listen, absolutely. But those guys can fight.
Yeah.
You have to remember, Vince could fight. I mean, he could fucking fight. I don't think Axl ever had a fight in his life. He was the guy that would run away, So that was just never, ever going to happen. But of course it blew up. It turned into this thing. And then his publicist did a very shitty thing, really, because she fell out with me because she was crazy about me and I didn't feel the same way. So that went south. Mm-hmm. And she told Kerrang, she said, so they were like, they were desperately trying to get more interviews. And Axl wouldn't. At this point, this is where Axl introduces the contracts. This was a big thing when Use Your Illusion came out. Everybody, if you wanted to interview Axl or any of the band, you had to sign a contract saying they owned it and they had approval. And of course, it went down like a lead balloon with the music press, particularly in the UK, because that just was not something, fucking Paul McCartney didn't ask for that. I mean, Bowie didn't ask for that. That just didn't fucking happen. And he did it. And of course, it blew up in his face. Everybody hated him for it. And thus began this reputation for being the Howard Hughes of rock, the weird guy. So the whole thing had endless repercussions, but one of which was Kerrang desperately trying to get another Axl interview under pressure from EMAP, who, again, all these people that weren't there dancing on the tables. And the publicist said to Jeff, I could maybe do something for you with Axl, but, we have a problem. And the problem was me. So I was never phoned. I was never spoken to. They just took my name off the masthead, and that was that. But again, endless sidebars to this. As this is happening, I'd already decided to leave because I had found, or I believed, was a new Def Leppard, only better. That was absolutely where I was at that moment. I'd got EMI to invest in some demos. Mm-hmm. We did a showcase. They flew me to LA to meet Capitol Records because clearly this was going to be a big American act as well. So, and I turned up in this suite, and I've been to LA a million times. I even had an apartment, but on this occasion they've laid on a suite at a hotel, and I turn up with this champagne and flowers in the room, and blah blah blah. I thought, here we go, and needless to say, it all came to shit because literally, just as I was setting up this deal, a little group from Seattle called Nirvana had this massive hit. And suddenly my new Def Leppard stunk like a 10-day-old corpse, and I couldn't get them off the ground. We'd gone from this is the most amazing new British act in decades to, oh no, you see, you look like Aerosmith. What we need are kids
flannel
in
shirts and
yeah.
It kind of went full circle. I mean, you were talking about the Sex Pistols earlier and them being very anti-institutional, anti-success, to the 80s when it was dancing on tabletops, who can have the biggest hair, who can have the biggest spotlight. And then in the 90s, again, it went back to being all anti-institution again.
Well, it certainly did in rock, and it became it was a time bomb that went off. I mean, it was overnight. Motley Crue stopped selling records, Poison, all those groups, and none of them were really built to last. I mean, let's be fair. Wasp and Poison and LA Guns, these were fantastic bands for their moment. But, we're not talking about Led Zeppelin here or the Rolling Stones or the Who or someone. These were here today, gone later today bands that were just amazing fun. And suddenly, through no fault of their own, it flips, and suddenly they look completely out of date. They look old-fashioned. They're from a previous decade. The whole house of cards just collapsed. And even Guns N' Roses, although they survived it, the years of ridicule had begun. I mean, just as Kurt is going out there in a moth-eaten cardigan and a pair of jeans that don't fit him, looking like he'd been up for 5 days on heroin because he had. And here's Axl in an Enormodome, with a fucking grand piano built into the seat of a pantomime Harley Davidson. I mean, it's just insane. I mean, November Rain, the video cost like $2 million.
Great video, though.
I hate that video.
Really?
Oh, man.
Mate, I love that guitar solo where Slash walks out of the church and is in the middle of this open field. Fantastic, mate. Iconic moment.
You mean where he's playing guitar on a mountaintop that isn't plugged in?
That's the exact same one, yes.
Yeah, there's no visible means of support for that guitar.
Wireless, mate, wireless.
No, it's called miming. And if you compare that to the Sweet Child of Mine video, which really did cost like $100 to make, the Sweet Child of Mine video is visceral. You're in that room. It's fucking feels dark and exciting. And although they're obviously miming in that, they don't look like it. It really looks like they're going for it. Whereas November Rain, straight out of the fevered brain of Axl Rose, who Alan Niven, when I was doing the book on them, their manager was telling me Axl would come in with these ideas for videos, and then he'd leave the meeting, and the video director would say, Alan, that's going to cost you $20 million if you do that video. And so they had to kind of circumnavigate that. But by the time you get to November Rain, Alan Niven's been fired. Anybody that ever said to Axl, maybe not such a good idea, everybody is fired. I'm in the shit club, which is now bigger than the people that aren't in the shit club. So the Axl Friends Society has dwindled to about 2 guys, and the shit club is everybody else, with me as a founding member. So not only that, so this happens, but suddenly Kerrang isn't special anymore. I mean, number one, they've let me go. I come back a couple of years later when I get back from LA, and I start writing for Raw magazine, which was a Kerrang offshoot. There's a whole backstory there. We'll get into that another time. And but Kerrang is no longer Kerrang. The days of Kerrang being the only magazine that would put Iron Maiden on the cover, Ozzy, Motorhead, Def Leppard, Metallica, Anthrax, endless. and not at a time when no other fucking magazine would do that. Those days are gone because NME, the Sydney Herald, you know, the London Times, the LA Doodah, everybody wants Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, and all the others. So Rolling Stone, Mojo, Q, everybody. So suddenly Kerrang is foundering, Raw is barely clinging on, and I turn up in the office in cowboy boots with long hair, and the minute I walked in the room, I was like, oh fucking hell, I'm like Back to the Future here, you know what I mean? So I remember literally going out the next day and buying some Dr. Martin boots and cutting my hair and trying to fit in. You know, we were all suddenly looking to fit in. Def Leppard, it was like after punk. Def Leppard cut their hair.
Yeah.
You know, Bon Jovi and Def Leppard both chose to bring out their greatest hits with a standalone single, which was a ballad, which would guarantee radio play and become a hit. And that, for Bon Jovi, it was Always, and for Def Leppard, it was a song I can't remember the name of, but it was like number one over here. You know, it was everybody, all the confidence and fun had gone. David Lee Roth put it really well. He goes, grunge, that was when fun stopped being fun. And it was true. All their careers withered on the vine. The magazine withered on the vine. Raw finally went out of business in '95, just as I bought my first house. Thanks, guys. And Kerrang began its slow descent into mediocrity, and how can we appeal to the broadest possible audience, which is why for the last 10 or 15 years in the UK, Kerrang is mainly bought by teenage girls. Nothing wrong with that, but you know, it's got the same name, but the magazine I helped build and turn into something well known, you know, that magazine died years and years ago. Well,
nowadays it tends to be the likes of Bring Me the Horizon or Black Veil Brides and whatnot who appeal to the sort of 16-year-old girl rocker market nowadays.
Yeah, I have no idea who that is you just mentioned. No more than you probably know who Rogue Male were, or Rock Goddess, or any of the other crazy lunatics.
I do remember Wet Cherry though from the Decline documentary. That was a band that was destined for greatness, if only.
What were they called? Wet Cherry.
Wet Cherry.
You see, I would love to have been at that meeting where the guy comes in and goes, guys, I've got it. I've got it. Wait, listen. Ready, listen, open your minds, listen, ready. Wet Cherry.
Oh, well, that's fucking it, man.
The other's like, dude, that's awesome. That's the most awesome name of a band ever. Right.
It was the 80s. It was 1985. They were one bottle deep of Jack Daniels and probably several grams deep of cocaine. It made sense.
Yeah, of course. Of course it did. Well, a lot of things do when you're like that. So it was when I look back, it's not so much the depravity. It really isn't. It's the fun I remember and the characters. I mean, every group had them. You know, like Poison were not Einstein when it came to music, but Bret Michaels, come on, CC DeVille,
Ricky
Rocket, and then on bass, the only one without blonde hair,
mysterious one.
Yeah. You know, just this stuff would just tickle the shit out of us for years and years and years. I mean, even Metallica were cartoon-like right up to the 90s when they began to take themselves very seriously. But before that, I mean, Lars was always known as Stars. because he was so clearly, starstruck and on a mission to become famous, no matter what. There was Stars, Bon Jovi. God, I can't remember. Loads of these things, like your best friends. You just took the piss, made up nicknames, and thoroughly enjoyed their company. So it was. Those are the things I remember. And these days, because I'm an old guy, clearly I have no fucking idea what's going on at ground roots level anymore. You just mentioned two groups I've never heard of. But I guess one would hope that these groups will produce incredible figures like the ones that inhabited the rock world.
They will. I mean, some of the figures you're alluding to, you mentioned Slash earlier, spending time at your place in London while he was recovering from his heroin addiction. You look at video games like, say, Guitar Hero 3, for example, which was a worldwide hit. And that came out a good 25 years after Use Your Illusion 1 and 2 came out. And who do they put on the cover? It's not some modern day rock god, if there is such a thing. It's Slash. They've got to go deep into the archives to find someone recognizable. And that's perhaps something that's missing nowadays. There's big iconic figures who stand the test of time, even 20 or 30 years later, without releasing too much notable content.
I agree. And I think the other thing is because I think there are some, I'll give you some names of some artists that I think are remarkable, young and new, but there isn't that kind of lineage. There isn't that extra context. Almost everybody we covered in the 80s had an enormous hinterland. Ozzy was Sabbath, Dio was Sabbath and Rainbow, Lemmy was Motorhead and Hawkwind, and everybody else that ever walked the earth. Thin Lizzy. All these people had really long backstories, and it made them more intriguing to know. It was like hanging out with your older brother's cool pals. You were suddenly going to places you only read about before. I don't see that right now with whatever the next generation is. However, that doesn't mean there isn't great music being made. I'm just not entirely sure if rock as we used to know it is in a place where it can be refreshed or reconfigured or represented in a different way. I think it's also ironic and knowing now that people don't even want that. They want authenticity. That's why people like me still have a career, an even better career than I ever had on Kerrang, because of the years I spent on Kerrang, because of all the other things I did where I either fell spectacularly on my face or I came out with something amazing like my Led Zeppelin book or my Jimi Hendrix book. Def Leppard and Journey, I remember seeing them on tour in 2018 in America. It was a co-headline. They did every arena and major stadium you can think of. And they both came away with over $100 million each. They're bigger now than they were back in the day because people want what we used to have.
Yeah.
Because it's an authentic experience.
We've also got multiple generations of fans heading out nowadays, like even grandparents in some cases taking their grandkids out to see Def Leppard and Iron Maiden and Kiss nowadays.
Well, absolutely. Def Leppard are now all pushing 60. So, their fans are plenty of scope for granddad and grandkids in that.
Yep.
But I mentioned, a couple of artists, and these are people that I find out about through my children, who are all teenagers. Billie Eilish, who everybody knows about at this point. But 2 years ago, when her first one or two tracks came out and my teenage daughters were playing it to me, I just thought, wow, what is this? Just when you thought you'd heard it all in pop music or rock music, along comes this young female artist who isn't going to dress provocatively or like a soft porn video. In fact, deliberately goes the other way. Here's a young artist that writes all her material with her brother. Very unique point of view, unique sound. I mean, the whole thing was incredibly intriguing. And I was doing a Sunday afternoon radio thing here at the time. In fact, it only ended a couple of months ago. We had a 2-year run. And I was talking about her all the time, ad nauseum. So I'm doing that to display the fact that I'm not late to that party. In fact, I was early through my kids. But another one, a boy, Youngblood. I don't know if you know about Youngblood out there in the rest of the world, but it's Young, B-L-U-D. I think it's all one word. Mm. This dude, he's English, but he's mainly in America. Fucking talented, crazy motherfucker. He kind of reminds me of what Axl would have been like had he not had Guns N' Roses, and had he been a bit more self-sufficient and less Asperger's-y, you know, because Youngblood brings out a new track every 2 or 3 weeks. And I get to hear about it because, you know, one of my daughters is insanely in love with him. But I mean, so I've seen his videos, his shows. This fucker is for real.
He's got a bit of an Axl Rose snarl going on. I'm just looking at some of his images at the moment. So it's interesting.
Totally.
It's interesting what you say there, though, because the nature of music nowadays, I mean, it's not like you need to press a CD or vinyl and have that distributed all over the world, and therefore you record 10 tracks once every 2 years and then tour in support of it. You can release a song every, once a month if you want to, and just get that out to the world through Spotify.
Well, that's exactly what he does and what he's been doing. And I think that's absolutely the way to go. I have 3 children, 2 daughters and a younger son, and they all love music. But the girls in particular are crazy about music. The eldest one is at university now, and she's at that stage where she's going back and discovering the history of all the great artists. My other daughter is 17, and she is all about right now. And everything is on her phone, everything. And they know what's going on. They are so cutting edge. And to see their excitement, I'm always saying to her name's Molly, I'm always saying, Molly, who is this? And she'll tell me. I'll go, say it again. All right, okay. And I keep up to date with stuff like that. And I think there's amazing stuff. I mean, Youngblood has what could be, the influences in his music are hip-hop, heavy metal, punk, just a raw attitude and a really talented guy. So I think, the spirit lives on. It just doesn't look like a guy in Whitesnake in 1988, I really think those days are gone unless it's reframed in a kind of an ironic, knowing way, which is everything is like that now. You don't need that. You want something that isn't like everything. So
it's interesting what you say there about your daughters being so into music and always they've got everything on their phones, and perhaps the whole concept of releasing a song once a month perhaps aligns with the teenage sort of, maybe it's not the attention span, but the fact that there's so many things vying for the attention of people's minds nowadays, that to sit there and listen to, say, 10 or 12 songs on one album without moving like you would back in the day, lock yourself in a room, pour yourself some Jack and listen to the album. Nowadays, people are reaching for their phone every 5 minutes. So perhaps releasing a song once every 4 weeks is the best way to capture their attention.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I think rock bands could learn a lot from this. The tragedy of most rock bands is that they make their best music in their 20s, and from there on in, it's just a case of trying to recapture that lightning, which they so rarely do. Yeah. But no, I think the culture we live in, you're exactly right. Even before streaming on the phone was the norm. I can remember when Lady Gaga was first a big star, and we'd be playing her music in the car for the kids. And I remember saying to one of my daughters, "Oh, no, what's this one called?" Hang on. Sorry, a dog just came in the room.
That's all good. The heavy metal pug, yes.
He's here. I'm saying, "What's this one called?" And she'd look at me like, she'd go, "Track 7." And I go, "Yeah, but what's it called?" "I don't know." I go, "But you've played it a million times." But and so now they're much more up with that. They know what things are called, but there's no sense of Youngblood is bringing out an album. Billie Eilish does albums, but it's not the grand event it used to be. It's kind of gone back to where it was in the late 50s, early 60s, where it was all about the single. Mm-hmm. And there will be an album at some point, but it will basically be the singles plus some other bits, and if you want it, you can have it, but it's not what drives that artist's profile or career. It's singles. And I think that's where we're at right now. I mean, we call them singles. I mean, that's such an old-fashioned term. They're just tracks. Yeah. But the kids know about it. The kids are on fire with this stuff because they're all connected with TikTok and everything else, and they all talk to each other. They know what's coming. They're ready for it, and they are on it like motherfuckers because they don't have to wait for the shop to open. They don't have to borrow the money from their parents. They just click. And there it is. So, personally, I like that. I think there were too many terrible albums made
for the sake of fulfilling contractual obligations with record companies.
Absolutely, or just straight out stealing. They talked about when people were stealing music. How about all the fucking years when they were sticking out these shitty 16-track CDs with 72 minutes of music, only 10 of which was any good, and charging 15 quid a pop. I mean, the whole, it was rape and thievery. So there was a bit of payback in the early 2000s. And it's still a tricky area. We're transitioning. I mean, books are, which is my field, they're definitely being hit in a similar way to the music business. Slightly less so because it's a different audience, it's a bigger audience, it's a different experience enjoying a book.
There is a bit of a return to form with books. I find that people now spending so much time staring at screens, they actually yearn to disconnect for 30 minutes or an hour or so and bury their head in a book.
Well, I hope that's true. I hope that's true. I mean, America, the kind of consensus culture it is really not at all book driven at all. I have many really smart, intelligent friends in America, and very few of them ever crack open a book. I think that's partly the American culture, but at the same time bothers me because you're quite right. I mean, I've got a Kindle. I've got all the same devices everybody else has got, but the novelty wore off real quick. And my favorite reading experience is I buy a lot of secondhand books, is to crack open a book that's clearly very old. You can smell how old it is. You can feel how old it is. And for me, that absolutely adds to my experience as a reader. It's tactile. The whole thing for me is lovely. You put it on the shelf.
It's analog. It's organic.
It's organic, and also if you're reading, you go, oh, you feel like you missed something. You go back a couple of pages and go, oh, okay. Yeah. I found that infuriating on Kindle, trying to, go back a page or two and then back. Where was I? And I find that much more bothersome than this beautiful technology that has existed for hundreds of years. Called a book. So yeah.
So I mean, speaking of writing books and speaking of writing for Kerrang, I mean, nowadays people are seeking out authenticity when it comes to their music. Now the mainstream charts don't always attest to that, but that's generally what people have sought after since the turn of the 80s into the 90s, and something that perhaps differentiated you from a lot of other rock writers was that authenticity, the fact that you would call it as you saw it. You were polarizing, and this resulted in you oftentimes winning both, I believe it was the most loved and the most hated, or the best and the worst writer at Kerrang magazine for like years on end.
Well, it would be best thing about Kerrang.
Yeah.
Worst thing about Kerrang. And one year I won both of those simultaneously.
Yeah.
And, you know, how do you take that? And the editor was like, well, you take that as the ultimate compliment. You know, the worst thing anybody can ever say about a writer is, oh, he's all right. Yeah. Did you like that story? Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. What did you think of that story? I hated it. I hate that guy. That fucking guy. I hate him. Yeah.
It's either 1K or 5Ks.
Absolutely. What did you think of that story? Oh, I love it. Love it. Best thing I've read in ages. You know, that's where you want to be. But by the time I wrote my first books back in the very late 80s, early 90s. But I don't really feel I became a proper book writer till the 2000s. And because things changed, you know, back in the 80s, 90s, you got nothing for writing books. And so you wrote them as if they were nothing because you weren't getting paid hardly anything. And it was almost a vanity thing. Things changed around about 2004 for me because of a book I wrote called Paranoid, which was a lot of fiction, a lot of reality, a lot of, I don't know what this is, I'm just going to write this thing that's ghastly and entertaining and weird. And off the back of that, I got approached by a literary agent, and suddenly I'm in a different realm in terms of how much money someone will pay me to write a book. And it meant I could spend more time and take them seriously. And if someone gives you a serious amount of money to do something, you take it, well, I don't know about everybody else, but me, I take it fucking seriously. The more money I get, the more serious I take something. And so at that point, I developed a completely different attitude to writing. And I had to make some tough choices. Do I preserve these relationships I have with artists and people in the business? Or do I just go for broke and try and write, you know, at the time, just one book at a time? Every book could be your last, you know. Should I just put everything into this and just see where it takes me? And that's what I did. And sure enough, it meant, you know, Jimmy Page stopped talking to me. James Hetfield stopped talking to me. Other examples. But at the same time, there were lots of people that now desperately wanted to talk to me because they'd read the books and they had a completely different idea of who I was at that point. And so that's been my formula ever since, which is to not try and deliberately burn bridges, but where it has to be done, it has to be done. And I just hope and pray that the work will be good enough that it will develop a new bridge to some other place, rather than wanting to. I hope you know. I hope the guys in Bon Jovi still like me. You know, I don't give a fuck. I mean, it's nice when we meet, but I don't lie awake at night worrying about that shit. I mean, I used to be at gigs every night for years and years and years, all over the world. And I don't do that anymore. I haven't done for a long time. I'm too busy writing books and trying to find the truth, which is a lot of fun, but does require a kind of monastic dedication and absolute discipline about not giving a shit who it might offend. And readers respond to that. People are not... A lot of people are stupid, but there are many people that aren't stupid. They see, they know. I mean, the less authenticity there is, the more attuned people are to it when it shows up. And that's genuinely the response I get, not just to my books, but podcasts, TV and radio stuff, live shows that I do. People love the truth. And sometimes the truth makes me look like a complete fucking idiot because I was at that moment, or can still be quite often. But they then believe you when you tell them the other stuff, because it's all coming from the same place. And that's what's interesting, to get, to try and share that stuff. And I'm the same way. I read books and listen to podcasts and watch TV and all that stuff. And it's always clear as day when someone has something and they are brave enough to let it hang out and skillful enough to present it in a way that hopefully will turn you on. So
definitely. So, I mean, you've published or written more than 20 books, and some of these books are absolute monsters. I mean, When Giants Walk the Earth, the 50 Years of Led Zeppelin book, I mean, that's what, I haven't got the book right in front of me right now, but from memory, it's over 600 pages. Same as your Metallica book, that was about 500 pages long. So obviously this requires a lot of dedication to your craft. And these are well-written books with a lot of humor and interesting anecdotes and all the rest of it. Do you think you could have written a book like When Giants Walk the Earth in 1985, Mick, when you were turning up to the office with 6 beers in tow?
Not in a million years. I could barely write it in 2007 and 2008 when I did write it. I mean, I had...
How long did it take you to write a book like that?
Led Zeppelin took me about 9 months. Mm-hmm. And that was pretty much working on just that and nothing else. I did take the occasional gig here and there, just a one-off thing here and there, only because it looked easy and there was money. But there were maybe 2 or 3 of those in the whole 9 months. I mean, the rest of it was all Zeppelin. My children were all babies at the time. My boy was 2. My girls were 7 and 4, 5. Mm-hmm. And I ended up renting a little place about 10 minutes drive away, like a little cottage, where that was me for 6 months, just working on the Led Zeppelin book. And every step of the way I was terrified, because they had given me a shitload of money to do it. And I froze. I was terrified. I'd never seen that much money. And I remember talking to John Houghton, who I now do the Get Your Rocks Off podcast with. Mm-hmm. I remember talking to John on the phone and saying, I can't do this. And he was like, why not? I'm like, what do you fucking mean, why not? He said, you're Mick Wall, aren't you? You're like the guy. You can write anything. And that made me so mad, because I thought, oh, don't blow me off like that. I'm really struggling here. But it did make me half the job is just sitting down, turn up at the desk and sit down, and then go for it. And a lot of days it doesn't work. 9 hours go by and you've written a page, and it's not even a very good page. I mean, that can happen all the time. But that took 9 months and a lot of sweat. I'd have nightmares. I had one nightmare where Jimmy Page was sending me a curse. A few dreams like that, actually. But I mean, I broke my ass. I did everything I possibly could to make that book good. And it was. I mean, it's a fantastic book. The one you're talking about, the 50 Years, that was the original book came out in 2008, and in 2018 was the 50th anniversary of them recording their first album. Mm-hmm. So in that, I wrote a kind of an update that covered those 10 years, but not just those 10 years. Since from the original book, quite a few people that I'd approached to interview for that book had said no for various reasons, and then had read the book subsequently and now really wanted to be in the update because it just was a huge success. And so it wasn't just bringing it up to date. I was able to go back and, I interviewed all the Yardbirds. I had Phil Carson, who'd been the president of Atlantic Records outside America, who was personally responsible for Zeppelin, Jason Bonham, loads and loads of people that didn't speak to me for the first book now spoke to me for the second book. So the updated one has about 40,000 extra words that the first one didn't. And the total wordage is about 250,000 words, which is about that's enough for
three and a half books. Huge. Well, my last book was a 70,000 word book for Wiley, so that's a good 3.5. So I can't imagine writing a 250,000 word book, 250,000 word book. But I mean, I loved what you talked through a moment ago as well, Mick, about sitting there. You've got this big pile of money. You're not sure you wanted to do it. You had that chat with John. Kind of takes me back to part one of our conversation and you writing for Sounds Magazine and just having that do or die attitude. Perhaps this time, admittedly, it wasn't so much do or die, but once you decided to do it, it was do or die. It just took you a little while to get there.
Oh, completely. It's always been do or die. I think that was just one of those very rare occasions where I felt fairly sure it was going to be die. And I bitched all the way through it. I mean, about 5 months in, I was begging my agent to say to the publishers, it's going to be 2 volumes, so I thought, well, at least if I give them, I've written enough that I could give them enough for a book if it was a first volume of 2, and then I can be out of this hell for a few months and finish the second one next year, and they weren't having it, just not having it. We've given you a ton of money. This is the deal, deliver the book. But hey, you learn. I mean, I've written about 15 books since then. And I mean, you said earlier over 20. It's actually more like over 40 because I've written books under different names. I've written books that I don't even have a copy of and have never even seen, for weird publishers in Canada or America or Japan, but these days, my most recent book on Jimi Hendrix, that's less than 100,000 words long, and for me, it's by far the best book I've ever written. But that's entirely from my point of view, and because with Hendrix, I really felt that this was like the Christ story, this kind of mythological being that appeared amongst the disciples and was considered the Son of God, and then died a horrible death, which in my view had nothing to do with an accidental overdose, but was in fact a murder. So I thought, well, we all think we know the broad outline of the Christ story, but you can interpret it and add to it and bring it to life in a way that people had never considered before. And so that's what I tried to do with Hendrix. It was, I already know I'm a great writer of this kind of stuff, but where can I take this where I haven't been before as a writer? And so that's what I did with Hendrix. And I got to tell you, man, it was a thrilling thing to do. It was very hard and so forth. And the publishers had a lot of problems with it, which has almost resulted in me never working with them again, because they wanted something much more vanilla and just told the same fucking story that millions of other books have told. And so there's a relationship I have now with the people that read my stuff or listen to my stuff, where I think they trust me to do right by them. even if they don't always like the finished product, I think they will they acknowledge at least that I'm trying to do something exceptional. And I'm doing it for all of us, you know, and I'm doing it about artists and music that so many of us are still intrigued by and in love with.
Definitely. And I mean, we're getting close to the tail end of this conversation. And one thing, I mean, we probably don't have time to talk about your producing documentaries at Sky or BBC Radio or co-founding Classic Rock magazine or being a founding editor back in 1997. But perhaps a good place to wrap up the Mick Wall story would be on some sort of, say, revelations you've had about life. Perhaps we can touch on death, but firstly about the empty existence that can be or was rock and roll in the 80s. And I believe you penned this elsewhere where you basically said that, you know, despite having access to so much sex, drugs, and so on, you eventually saw how fake and empty the existence was for most, if not all, of the bands you covered. And how that also applied to your own life. And like you said, you mentioned now you've got a young family, you're married, you're living in the relatively peaceful surrounds of Oxfordshire. I mean, what have you learned about that? And what are you doing differently nowadays? Obviously, the heroin's gone, the hard driving lifestyle's gone. But now that you're 62, you've been in this game for 4 decades. I mean, what are some of the really sort of profound life lessons that you have learned along that way?
I don't know if that's the sort of thing I can really nutshell.
Well, what about the empty of existence and how you've pulled it? I mean, what did it take for you to realize that the existence was empty, and how have you transformed yourself, shall we say, for lack of a better word?
I don't know, Steve. I think it's an ongoing mission. I mean, the whole hard drugs thing ended for me nearly 40 years ago. And there was a period after that and before Kerrang where I really didn't feel I'd ever go back to writing about music. I desperately didn't want to. I tried everything not to. And I would try again in the 90s. But the thing is, I'm just supremely unqualified to do anything else. The only other jobs I was able to muster up, you know, were low-paying gigs. And not only was that boring and difficult, but I just felt wasn't really using the best of me. I knew I had a certain talent in certain areas. I mean, I basically know nothing about 75% of life, or I know enough about it to know I'm no fucking good at it. The things I am good at are writing and talking and performing and that kind of stuff. And listening. I think you have to be a fantastic listener before you can open your own mouth. In the same way that, you know, I read hundreds of books to every one that I write, because that's where the real pleasure is for me. I think the whole kind of emptiness thing is a constant battle. But I think for me, those kind of rock years was when I kind of I took a sidestep. I just went, you know what, I'm not figuring this out very well at all. So what I'm going to do, I mean, I didn't say this, but that's what I feel looking back, is I'm going to just allow myself to be diverted and distracted into this weird thing that I've bumped into accidentally, which means I'm on a plane going somewhere more interesting than sitting at home doing a boring job. It was as basic as that. But then as the years went by and the years went by, there came a moment in my 30s where I thought, is this it? I didn't sign up to make this a lifetime mission. It was just a diversion to get me out of a bad place in my life. So there were a lot of years in the 90s and early 2000s when I really shunned that part of my life. And then suddenly I kind of embraced it. I think after Led Zeppelin, I embraced the fact that that's who, Mick Wall, the writer, is to most people. And so let's make the most of it, but let's not do it 100% just for fun and for kicks and for thrills and for laughs. Let's see if I can bring something to this that isn't empty and shallow. And I think that's the answer. I think people like Get Your Rocks Off, the podcast, because it's fun and you learn things you didn't know. But I think what people really respond to is heart. They like it. They know there is some heart in there. My family are Irish, and the people that tell the best Irish jokes are Irish. The best people to tell Jewish jokes are Jewish comedians. They just, we know this stuff inside out. We are the ones that can make funny. And that's how it is with rock and metal. I think that's how it is in the current world where, thank God, if you like AC/DC, that means you can't like Billie Eilish. Thankfully, I think we've gone way past that. And while we're all stuck in our own silos, I do think there's a new way of blending realities so that people are more accommodating, hopefully, of the fact that life is just fucking weird for everybody. And it's like that alcoholic thing of one day at a time. I find at my age, the same shit is still happening to me that ever happened to me. Whenever I think things are going good, you just know that the very next moment you're going to get hit over the head by a mallet. But you that's what makes you interesting. That's what brings the laugh. That's that what's the note of recognition that nobody's impervious, and anybody that acts like they are definitely deserves the piss taken. And also that just I don't want to say rebellious, but free, a questioning, free spirit, so that when you don't know everything, it means you can learn something all the time. And that's the key, really, is those small moments that make up real joy.
Yeah. As Socrates said, the more you know that you know nothing, and that beginner's mindset ultimately opens you up to new experiences and new ways of looking at the world. And one last question to put a close to the Mick Wall story, Mick. You were quoted as saying that you don't want to be the guy with the hammer anymore. Life really is too short, as Lemmy and David Bowie proved. What did you mean by that?
Well, I had a long period. I mentioned the book Paranoid. That was bringing the hammer down.
Yeah.
My biography of Axl Rose in 2007, that was bringing the hammer down. I really believe life was a bucket of shit, and that if you didn't start from that standpoint, you really didn't get it. But as you mentioned, I have children. I have a much deeper appreciation of life now. And I certainly don't believe life is a bucket of shit. I believe the opposite. I think we can shit in the pot of life. And I think life is a yin-yang, sun, moon, night, day, good, bad. You gotta take it all the same way. And I think what I was trying to say with that is I'm not this young, angry guy anymore. I'm not saying the anger has gone, the youth has gone, but that doesn't mean their search has gone. It doesn't mean their desire to go and do something brand new today, this day, has gone. I just don't have any points to prove in terms of telling the kids Santa Claus isn't real. I've done that. I think we're past that. I think, what else can you show me? And right now, as I talk to you, I'm looking out. I live on a house on a farm, not my farm, but it affords me this wonderful view over what's known as the Thames Valley. And you can't look at that and feel that life is a bucket of shit, you know, because it clearly isn't. It has been, it is for a lot of people, and it has been for me, and it will continue to be on those terrible days that always come around. But I do believe in hope, and I do believe that I do believe in karma. I don't think it's a silver bullet. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution to anything. But I do believe that good things come around. You know, the bad things come around without any help whatsoever. But the good things take a little bit more of a nudge, and that's kind of where to go.
Well, that's a beautiful place to end this conversation, Mick. This has been an absolute treat, and I'm sure our listeners will enjoy it as much as I did. Of course, you still have desire to go out and do great things in the world, but right now you're working on a little podcast called Get Your Rocks Off. And if people want to deep dive into all those crazy stories from the Kerrang days, even beyond the Kerrang days, going back into the 70s, and who knows, maybe even the 60s and parts of the 90s, you know where to find us. Here we are at Get Your Rocks Off. And of course, if they want to deep dive into some of your books, if they haven't read your extensive catalog, they can find them all at Amazon.com. Mick, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Steve. Always great to speak to you.
Hi guys, Steve again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to receive a weekly email from me, complete with reflections, books I've been reading, words of wisdom, and access to blogs, ebooks, and more that I'm publishing on a regular basis, just leave your details at futuresquared.xyz/subscribe and you'll receive the very next one. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, take a minute to like, share, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It goes a long way to giving the podcast the exposure it needs so I can continue bringing you guests and conversations of the highest caliber. You can catch me on Twitter at Steve Glibeski and on Instagram at @TheSteveGlibeski. Until next time.
Hasta la vista, baby.
This has been a No Filter Media production.
Say what you want.